The thin line between safety and terror. We spend 90% of our lives operating under a dangerous delusion. We believe that a locked door creates a fortress. We turn the deadbolt, hear that satisfying mechanical click, and convince ourselves that the chaos of the outside world has been successfully shut away. We wrap ourselves in blankets and tell ourselves we are safe. But the terrifying truth is actually quite simple. A lock is just a suggestion to the determined. It is nothing more than a polite request to stay out. And for the kind of people who stalk the edges of our reality, polite requests mean absolutely nothing. True safety is an illusion we construct just to be able to close our eyes at night. If we really thought about how fragile the glass in our windows is, or how easily a latch can be pried open with a simple screwdriver, we would never sleep again. But deep down, beneath the logic and the routine, your instincts know better. That is why you get that sudden, prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you are sitting in a room by yourself. It is why silence at 3 a.m. feels physically heavier and louder than silence at noon. It is that ancient, primal part of your brain recognizing that you are vulnerable, even if you can't see the predator yet. In the next few minutes, we are going to dismantle that illusion of safety completely. We are going to step into 4 distinct nightmares where the boundaries between the mundane and the horrific dissolve. You will stand in an isolated suburban home while a storm rages outside, masking the sound of footsteps that have no business being there. You will walk the cold, labyrinthine back rooms of a retail giant, where the shadows are deep enough to hide a living, breathing secret that has been watching you for hours. You will freeze in a foggy parking lot at midnight, realizing that the technology in your pocket is being used to hunt you. And finally, you will see how the exposed digital world invites monsters right through your front door without you even realizing you invited them in. These aren't just ghost stories to tell around a campfire. They are warnings. They are reminders that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a lazy coworker, a wrong number, or a friendly customer with a nice smile. By the time we are done here, your perception of your own security will be permanently altered. You might want to pause right now and actually check your window before you read the first line. Go ahead, check the lock. Because for one teenager, the nightmare didn't start with a scream. It started with a feeling, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that most people would have ignored. Let's go back to the summer of 2015, to a quiet stucco house in Tampa, Florida, where the humidity is thick enough to choke you, and the silence is about to be shattered. The guardian at the glass door. The sound wasn't thunder. It was the wet, deliberate tap of a fingernail on glass. It was distinct, rhythmic, and terrifyingly close, cutting through the ambient noise of the storm outside like a razor. I was 16 years old, living in that kind of suburban bubble where safety feels like a given right, a guarantee written into the Homeowners Association bylaws. It was the summer of 2015, and my parents had driven down to the Keys for a week-long vacation, leaving me alone in our single-story stucco home just outside of Tampa. They left with the usual barrage of warnings about parties and locking doors, my dad joking that I was holding down the fort. I wasn't worried. I had my Xbox, a fridge stocked with junk food, and Max. Max was our 90-pound golden retriever, a dog that was usually more interested in chasing tennis balls and sleeping on the air conditioning vents than guarding anything. But he was big, loud, and he was my best friend. That first night, the illusion of safety began to crack. It was close to midnight, and a typical Florida storm was rolling in, the kind that turns the sky purple and shakes the windows in their frames. I was on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through Reddit, when Max stopped panting. He lifted his head, ears swiveled back, and let out a low, vibrating growl. It wasn't his playful bark. It was a deep, guttural rumble that I felt in my chest. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. I tried to tell myself it was a tree branch or a frog jumping against the screen. We had massive tree frogs that would thud against the glass. But Max was staring dead at the front door, the fur on his neck bristling into a stiff ridge. I summoned the courage to stand up and peek through the blinds. The porch light illuminated nothing but slashing rain and empty pavement. I double-checked the deadbolt, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and eventually convinced myself I was just being paranoid. The next day, the heat was suffocating. The air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing soup. I tried to shake off the previous night's jitters by playing fetch with Max in the backyard. That was when I saw the side gate. My dad was obsessive about security. He kept that wooden gate padlocked 24/7. But now, it was swinging slightly in the breeze. I walked over, and my stomach dropped. The latch wasn't just unhooked. The metal was bent, twisted as if someone had taken a heavy screwdriver and pried it open with brute force. A cold chill washed over me despite the 90-degree heat. I called my dad immediately, but he brushed it off, blaming the landscapers. "Don't stress," he said. "Just lock it up and keep the dog inside." I did as I was told, shoving a rusted padlock through the hole. But the feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Night fell, and the house felt different. It felt porous. Around 1 a.m., the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't the front door. It was coming from the sliding glass door in the back, the one that led to the yard where I had found the broken gate. It was softer now, a slow, taunting scratch against the glass. Max didn't just growl this time. He exploded. He launched himself at the slider, barking with a ferocity I had never seen before. I grabbed my phone and flicked on the backyard floodlights. For a single, heart-stopping second, I saw him. A man, a silhouette in a white t-shirt and dark shorts, standing just inches from the glass. He ducked away the moment the light hit him, disappearing into the shadows of the yard like a ghost. I called 911, my voice trembling so hard the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat my address twice. By the time the police arrived 15 minutes later, he was gone. They found footprints in the wet sand near the fence, but shrugged it off as a prowler. They told me to keep the doors locked and left. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with a baseball bat across my lap, watching the windows until the sun came up. By the third night, exhaustion was making me hallucinate. I had wedged a broom handle into the track of the sliding door, a trick I'd seen in movies, and checked every lock 3 times. I eventually passed out on the floor of my bedroom, Max curled protectively by my side. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of my worst nightmare. It wasn't a tap. It was a crash. The sound of tempered glass exploding echoed through the house like a gunshot. I bolted upright, disoriented, and terrified. Max didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a command. He launched himself out of the bedroom and down the hall, a golden blur of teeth and fury. I heard heavy boots crunching on broken glass. Then a man's voice, low and angry. "Shut up, dog." Then came the sickening sound of a struggle, a thud, a yelp. But Max didn't stop snarling. I grabbed the aluminum bat, my hands slick with sweat, and crept into the hallway. The air smelled of wet grass, adrenaline, and the metallic tang of fear. I turned the corner into the living room and saw a nightmare unfolding. A man in a dark hoodie was wrestling with Max amidst the shards of the shattered door. He was swinging something, a crowbar, but Max had his jaws clamped tight around the man's forearm, refusing to let go even as he was slammed against the coffee table. Something primal took over me. I didn't think, I just reacted. I screamed and charged, swinging the bat with every ounce of strength I had. I connected with the man's shoulder, feeling the jarring impact vibrate up my arms. He howled in pain, finally shaking Max off, and scrambled backward through the broken door frame, disappearing into the dark, wet yard. I slammed the heavy wooden blackout shutters closed and collapsed, pulling a bleeding Max into my arms while I dialed 911 again. This time, the police found a trail of blood leading to the fence. Max had done his job. A few days later, a detective called. They had arrested a man in his late 20s a few neighborhoods over, trying to force his way into another home. He had a shattered shoulder and deep, infected bite marks on his arm. He was a career criminal with a history of violence. He admitted that he had been watching my house for days, waiting for the right moment. It has been over a decade since that summer. Max recovered from his injuries, though he had a permanent notch in his ear and a slight limp on rainy days. He passed away 3 years ago, old and tired, but vigilant to the very end. I buried him under the oak tree in the backyard, the same yard where he stood his ground against a monster. I still live with the memory of that sound, the shattering glass, and the knowledge that a thin layer of silica was the only thing separating me from a violent stranger. I learned that night that walls don't protect you. Vigilance does. But sometimes, the danger isn't trying to break in from the outside. Sometimes, The threat is already inside, hiding in the places you're supposed to feel safest. That job at Walmart taught me that lesson the hard way. The shadow in the stockroom. Laziness is usually just a mild annoyance, a character flaw that forces everyone else to pick up the slack. But I never imagined that simple laziness could be the camouflage for a predator. I was working at a super Walmart in a town that sat uncomfortably between up and coming and completely abandoned. It was the graveyard shift, the hours between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. when the store transforms from a chaotic marketplace into a sterile, flickering cathedral of consumerism. The job itself was mindless stocking shelves, crushing cardboard, and zoning aisles, but the environment was unique. The back room of a super Walmart is massive. It is a concrete labyrinth of towering steel racks, endless pallets of overstock, and dark corners where the motion sensor lights always seem to time out just when you need them. And then there was Austin. Every workplace has an Austin. He was the kind of guy who had turned avoiding work into an art form. He would clock in at 9:59 p.m., grab a pallet jack to look busy, and then vanish. He had hiding spots mapped out all over the store, behind the wall of toilet paper in the paper goods aisle, inside the fort of dog food bags in the garden center, and deep in the recesses of the back room. We all knew it. The managers knew it, but because the turnover rate was so high, as long as he showed up and didn't steal, they kept him on the payroll. I usually just rolled my eyes when I saw him disappear. It meant more cardio for me, but I wasn't a snitch. One Tuesday night, the store was particularly dead. The silence in the back room was heavy, broken only by the hum of the industrial freezers and the occasional clank of a forklift in the distance. I was assigned to binning, which meant I had to organize the overflow inventory in the deepest part of the warehouse, an area we called the boneyard. It was a dimly lit section where seasonal items went to die. Around 1 a.m., I was hauling a pallet of detergents back toward the steel racks when I saw him. Or, at least, I thought I saw him, tucked away in a narrow gap between two towering stacks of televisions and a concrete pillar. I saw a pair of legs and an arm. The person was sitting on an overturned milk crate, hidden deep in the shadows. I sighed, shaking my head. Classic Austin, I muttered to myself. He had found a new nest. I ignored him, parked my pallet, and went back to the sales floor. I wasn't going to waste my breath telling him to get back to work. 2 hours passed. I had finished the detergent aisle and needed to grab some overstock paper towels. I navigated the maze of the back room again, the wheels of my pallet jack squeaking rhythmically against the polished concrete. As I rounded the corner to the boneyard, I glanced at the gap between the TVs. The arm hadn't moved. The legs were in the exact same position. A spike of irritation hit me. It was one thing to take a 20-minute nap. It was another to sleep through a quarter of the shift while the rest of us were sweating. I parked the jack with a loud thud and stomped over to the gap. "Yo, Austin," I called out, my voice echoing off the metal ceiling. "Manager's doing a walkthrough. You might want to wake up." The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, the annoyance shifting into something else, maybe concern. What if he was actually hurt? I reached the edge of the pallet and leaned in. "Austin, seriously, get up." The figure stood up, but the movement was wrong. It wasn't the groggy, stumbling rise of a teenager caught sleeping on the job. It was fluid, sharp, and alert. And as the figure stepped out of the shadow of the TV stack and into the fluorescent light, the blood drained from my face. It wasn't Austin. It was a man I had never seen before. He was older, maybe in his 40s, wearing clothes that were caked in layers of grime, a torn flannel shirt and jeans that looked stiff with grease. His hair was matted, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, and completely devoid of fear. He didn't look like a customer who had wandered into the wrong area. He looked like part of the inventory. For a second, neither of us said anything. My brain was trying to process the logic. Vendor? Truck driver? Repairman? The man stared at me, his head tilted slightly, and then, without a word, he turned and walked briskly toward the receiving bays. He didn't run. He just walked with a terrifying, purposeful speed. "Hey," I yelled, finally finding my voice. "You can't be back here." He didn't acknowledge me. He turned a corner around a stack of water pallets and vanished. I stood there, heart pounding, confused. I convinced myself it was just a homeless guy who had slipped in to get warm. I checked the area where he had been sitting. There was a pile of candy wrappers and an empty bottle of Gatorade. He had been there a while. I went back to the floor and told a manager, but they were swamped with a delivery issue and just told me they'd keep an eye out. I didn't push it. I just wanted the night to end. At 6 a.m., the store officially closed to the few customers who were there, and the doors were locked. The night crew was wrapping up. I saw the real Austin near the time clock, looking refreshed and playing on his phone, waiting for 7 a.m. to punch out. I shook my head, grabbing my box cutter to finish breaking down one last pile of cardboard in the back. I walked down the main corridor of the warehouse, a straight shot of concrete that ran nearly the length of the building. It was empty. The motion lights at the far end flickered off, plunging the distance into darkness. Then, the lights at the far end flickered back on. Standing there, at the very end of the hallway, about 100 yards away, was the man in the flannel shirt. He wasn't walking away this time. He was facing me, and he was holding something in his hand. A long metallic object that glinted under the lights. A pipe? A crowbar? I froze. "Hey, the store's locked," I shouted, my voice trembling. The man didn't speak. He dropped his shoulder and started to run. He didn't jog. He sprinted. It was a dead sprint, straight down the center of the aisle, heading directly for me. The sound of his heavy boots slamming against the concrete echoed like gunshots. Thud, thud, thud. Panic, cold and absolute, seized my chest. I didn't think. I dropped the box cutter and turned around. I ran. I ran harder than I have ever run in my life. I could hear him behind me, the gap closing, his breathing heavy and wet in the acoustic echo chamber of the warehouse. I didn't look back. I burst through the swinging double doors onto the sales floor, screaming for help. "Call the cops! He's in the back!" I yelled, nearly colliding with the produce manager. I spun around, expecting the man to burst through the doors behind me. The doors swung back and forth, settling into stillness. He didn't come out. The police arrived 5 minutes later with a K9 unit. They swept the back room. They didn't catch him. He had vanished again, but they found out how he had gotten in. At the far end of the warehouse, hidden behind a stack of empty pallets, was a fire exit door. The push bar had been taped down, and a small piece of wood had been wedged into the frame to keep it from latching. It was the door closest to Austin's favorite hiding spot. The police found a makeshift bed made of cardboard and stolen pillows tucked behind the baler machine. They found food wrappers, bottles of urine, and a knife. The man had been living there, not for hours, but likely for days. He'd been sleeping in the shadows while we worked, watching us, eating our food, and moving freely through the dark. The theory was simple. Austin, in his infinite laziness, had propped the door open so he could sneak out for smoke breaks without tripping the alarm, or maybe just to let in fresh air while he napped. He had unknowingly invited a predator into our sanctuary. I quit 2 months later. I couldn't handle the silence of the back room anymore. Every shadow looked like a man. Every stack of boxes looked like a hiding spot. Austin eventually got fired for attendance and, ironically, got a job at Target. I heard he bragged about it, completely oblivious to the fact that his sloth had nearly gotten someone killed. I thought leaving that job would leave the fear behind. I thought that once I was out of that dark, enclosed warehouse, I would be safe. But I learned that the walk to the car can be just as haunted as the building you're leaving. Because while walls can hide monsters, the open space of a parking lot at night offers them nowhere to hide except right beside you. The breather on the line. That job taught me to check every dark corner. But I eventually learned that the open spaces are just as dangerous. There is a specific kind of silence in a Walmart parking lot at 2 a.m. A silence that amplifies every sound. It's a vacuum where the hum of the highway lights sounds like electricity frying, and the distant slam of a car door sounds like a gunshot. Years after the warehouse incident, I had moved to a different city, a place where the sprawl of suburbia bled into endless strip malls. I was still a night owl, old habits die hard, and I had developed a ritual of doing my grocery shopping long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. There was something almost meditative about walking through a 24-hour supercenter when it was empty. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, the aisles were wide and unobstructed, and the chaotic energy of the daytime crowds had evaporated, replaced by a sterile, humming peace. On this particular Tuesday, I arrived a little after midnight. The fog had rolled in off the coast, thick and heavy, turning the parking lot into a gray soup. I parked my sedan in the back of the lot, habit dictating that I avoid door dings, and walked toward the glowing blue logo of the store. Inside, it was business as usual. A few employees were lazily restocking the dairy section, and the self-checkout lanes stood like silent sentries at the front. I grabbed a handbasket, not needing much, just milk, cereal, and maybe a frozen pizza, and started my rounds. I was in the cereal aisle, debating between two brands of granola, when the silence was broken. My phone began to ring. It wasn't a ringtone I recognized immediately, because I usually kept it on vibrate, but the shrill, digital chime echoed loudly against the linoleum floor. I pulled it out of my pocket. It was an unknown number, no caller ID, just a string of digits that didn't look local. I frowned. Who calls at 12:30 a.m., assuming it was an emergency or maybe a drunk friend with a new number? I slid my thumb across the screen. Hello? Silence. Hello? Who is this? Then I heard it. It wasn't static. It was breathing. Wet, heavy, rhythmic breathing. It sounded close, like the person had the microphone pressed directly against their lips. Is this a joke? I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the empty aisle. The breathing hitched slightly, then continued. In, out, in, out. I hung up, annoyed. Idiot, I muttered, shoving the phone back into my pocket. I figured it was a wrong number or some bored kids prank calling random digits. I went back to my shopping, but the meditative peace was gone. The store felt bigger now, emptier. 5 minutes later, I was in the frozen food section when the phone rang again. Same number. My stomach tightened. I stared at the screen, the blue light illuminating the frost on the glass door in front of me. I shouldn't have answered, but anger overrode my common sense. I wanted to tell them to knock it off. Listen, I snapped as I picked up. Stop calling me. Silence again. Then, that same wet, heavy breathing. But this time, it sounded faster. Excited. I'm hanging up, I said, my voice wavering. Don't call again. I ended the call and stood there for a moment, shivering in the cold air of the freezer aisle. The store was dead silent. I looked around, half expecting to see someone snickering at the end of the aisle, phone in hand, but there was no one, just rows of frozen pizzas and vegetables. I decided I was done. I didn't need the pizza. I walked briskly to the front, paid for my few items at the self-checkout, and headed for the exit. I just wanted to get back to my car and go home. I stepped through the sliding automatic doors and was hit by the wall of humidity. The fog had thickened while I was inside. The parking lot lights were surrounded by hazy halos, and visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. I scanned the lot for my car. It was parked way in the back, obscured by the mist. As I walked, the silence of the lot pressed in on me. The only sound was the crunch of my sneakers on the asphalt. As my car came into view, my steps faltered. Someone was leaning against it. A man was resting his weight against the driver's side door of my sedan. He was facing away from me, looking out toward the dark tree line that bordered the property. He was wearing a dark gray hooded sweatshirt with the hood pulled up and baggy black pants. There were no other cars parked near mine for at least 10 spaces. There was absolutely no reason for him to be there. I stopped about 20 feet away, my heart hammering against my ribs. My keys were clutched in my hand, the metal biting into my palm. I didn't know what to do. Should I yell? Should I hit the panic button on my key fob? Then, the silence was shattered again. My phone rang. The sound was deafening in the quiet lot. I jumped, nearly dropping my basket. I reached into my pocket with a trembling hand and pulled it out. It was the same number. I looked at the phone. Then I looked at the man leaning on my car. I answered it. I didn't say anything. I just held the phone to my ear. In perfect synchronization, the man by my car raised his right hand. He was holding a cell phone. He pressed it to his ear. My blood turned to ice. The heavy breathing filled my ear, magnified by the connection. Are you... I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. Are you standing by my car right now? The man didn't say a word. He just hung up. The line went dead in my ear at the exact moment he lowered his hand. Slowly, terrifyingly slowly, he turned around. He was far enough away that I couldn't see his features clearly in the fog, but I saw one detail that made my brain short-circuit. He was wearing sunglasses. Pitch black, wrap-around sunglasses. In the middle of the night, in the fog, he stood there, facing me, his head cocked slightly to the side like a curious bird. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I spun on my heel and ran back toward the store. I didn't look back until I was through the sliding doors. When I turned around, the parking lot was empty. He hadn't chased me. I stood in the vestibule, hyperventilating, trying to explain to the greeter that there was a man by my car, but the words got stuck in my throat. I waited inside for 10 minutes, pacing near the carts, watching the parking lot through the glass. I convinced myself he must have left. He was just trying to scare me. It worked. I eventually built up the courage to leave again, but this time I didn't walk. I sprinted. I ran to my car, keys ready, unlocked the door, threw myself inside, and locked it in one fluid motion. I started the engine and threw it into reverse, my eyes scanning the mirrors. That's when I saw him. He was walking out of the store entrance. He hadn't left. He had followed me inside. He must have been walking down a parallel aisle, or maybe he was watching me from the shadows of the vestibule while I paced. He strolled casually out of the automatic doors, phone in hand, sunglasses still on, watching my car peel out of the parking spot. I drove home doing 80 on the freeway, checking my rearview mirror every 5 seconds. I never saw the car following me. I blocked the number immediately, but I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room with the lights on, staring at my phone. The questions still haunt me more than the fear. Who was he? Was it random? But the scariest question is the one I can't answer. How did he get my number? I hadn't given it to anyone, and I hadn't used a loyalty card. He was a stranger in a parking lot, yet he had a direct line to me before I even knew he existed. I never went back to that Walmart. And to this day, if my phone rings from an unknown number late at night, I don't answer it. I learned that my privacy was thinner than I thought, but at least that stranger had remained a faceless threat, a ghost in the fog. The next time I dealt with a stalker, he wouldn't be anonymous. He would be someone I had smiled at, someone I had been polite to, someone I had unknowingly invited into my life, a customer who wouldn't let go. At least that stranger had remained a faceless threat, a ghost in the fog. The next time I dealt with a stalker, he wouldn't be anonymous. He would be someone I had smiled at, someone I had been polite to, someone I had unknowingly invited into my life because society taught me that being nice was more important than being safe. It started with a compliment, the kind you are taught to accept with a blush and a smile. I was 20 years old, home from college for the summer, and working as a cashier at a Walmart about 10 minutes from my parents' house. It was the kind of job where you turn your brain off. Beep, bag, beep, bag. Have a nice day. You become a robot, smiling on autopilot, absorbing the minor frustrations of customers who are mad about the price of eggs or the length of the line. Then, he came to my lane. He was young, probably 23 or 24, dressed in a clean polo shirt and jeans. He wasn't ugly, but he had an intensity to him that made the hair on my arms stand up. He didn't unload his cart immediately. He just stood there, watching me scan the items of the elderly woman in front of him. When it was his turn, he didn't look at the card reader or his groceries. He looked right at me. "You have beautiful eyes," he said. It was standard cashier flirtation. I gave my standard response a polite, tight-lipped smile and a quiet, "Thank you." I kept scanning. Beep. Bag. "I'm serious," he pressed, leaning slightly over the belt. "You're really beautiful. Do you have Instagram?" This is the moment where people who haven't been in this position say, "Why didn't you just say no?" But when you are a young woman alone in a service job, and a man is leaning into your personal space, blocking the line, staring at you with that unblinking intensity, no feels dangerous. No starts an argument. No makes you a bitch. So, I chose the path of least resistance. I chose the path that would get him out of my line and out of the store the fastest. "Yeah," I said, reciting my handle quickly. "It's just my name. I expected him to type it in later. Instead, he pulled out his phone right there, searching for it, while I stood awkwardly holding his bag of chips. "Found you," he said, grinning. He tapped the follow button, showed me the screen like a trophy, and finally paid. "I'll see you around." He walked away, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I thought that was it. I thought he was just another guy shooting his shot. I was wrong. The notifications started before his car even left the parking lot. "Started following you. Liked your photo. Liked your photo. Liked your photo. Message request. Hey, it's the guy from Walmart. You really are gorgeous." I ignored it. I went home, ate dinner, and tried to forget about the awkward interaction. But the phone kept buzzing. By the next morning, he had sent 5 more messages. "Hey, what are you doing? You work today? I'd love to take you out. Why aren't you answering?" I decided to nip it in the bud. I replied, keeping it polite but firm. "Hey, sorry, I'm not really looking to date right now. Just focusing on work and school. Thanks, though." I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The rejection flipped a switch in his brain. The messages shifted from flirtatious to desperate, and then to aggressive. He sent paragraphs about how we were perfect for each other, how he felt a connection in the checkout line, how I was being stuck up for ignoring a nice guy like him. In 48 hours, he sent over 30 messages. My phone felt like a ticking bomb. I finally blocked him. Block. Delete. Done. 2 hours later, a new notification popped up. A brand new account with no profile picture requested to follow me. The message read, "You can't just block me. We need to talk." I blocked that one too. Then I made my account private. I thought I had built a wall he couldn't climb, but digital walls are full of cracks. A few days later, my best friend texted me, "Hey, who is this guy messaging me asking about your schedule?" My blood ran cold. He had gone through my following list before I went private. He was messaging my friends, acting like he was an old acquaintance trying to surprise me at work. He wanted to know my shifts. He wanted to know what car I drove. I told everyone to block him, but the damage was done. He knew I was scared, and he knew where to find me. The shift from digital harassment to physical presence happened the next week. I was working the closing shift again. The store was winding down. I looked up from counting my drawer and saw him. He wasn't in line. He wasn't shopping. He was sitting on the wooden bench near the exit doors, the one usually occupied by husbands waiting for their wives. He was just sitting there, hands folded in his lap, staring directly at register 4, staring at me. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched. It was a dead, flat stare, devoid of the charm he had tried to fake during our first meeting. It was the stare of someone who feels entitled to your attention. I tried to ignore him, but my hands were shaking so bad I kept dropping coins. Every time I glanced up, he was still there, a statue in a polo shirt. After 20 minutes of this psychological torture, I flagged down my manager, a burly guy named Dave. "Dave," I whispered, voice trembling. "That guy on the bench. He's stalking me online. He won't leave." Dave didn't ask questions. He looked at the guy, saw the intensity of the stare, and nodded. He walked over to the bench. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw Dave gesture toward the door. The guy didn't argue. He stood up, cast one last venomous look in my direction, and walked out the automatic doors. I breathed a sigh of relief. I thought Dave had scared him off. At 10 p.m., I clocked out. The store was locked behind me. I walked out into the humid night air, keys interlaced between my fingers like Wolverine claws a trick every woman knows. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for the employee cars clustered under a light pole. I was halfway to my car when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. He hadn't left. He was waiting in his car, parked 3 rows over, with the lights off. As soon as I stepped onto the asphalt, his headlights flicked on. The twin beams blinded me for a second, and then I heard the engine rev. I didn't scream. I didn't freeze. I bolted. I sprinted toward my car, a beat-up Honda Civic parked 50 yards away. I heard his tires squeal against the pavement. He wasn't trying to run me over. He was trying to cut me off. He was trying to block me in. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. I hit the unlock button, threw the door open, and practically dove into the driver's seat. Screech. His car skidded to a halt diagonally behind me, blocking me from backing out. I slammed my door and hit the lock button just as a shadow fell over the window. Thud. 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 He was at my window. He was banging his fist against the glass, his face twisted into a mask of rage that looked nothing like the polite boy from the checkout line. He was yelling something, but the blood rushing in my ears drowned it out. I fumbled with the ignition. The engine sputtered and caught. I didn't care about his car. I didn't care about the paint. I threw the Honda into reverse, cut the wheel hard, and slammed on the gas. My bumper scraped against his fender with a sickening crunch, but I forced my way through the gap. I threw it into drive and peeled out of the lot, running the red light at the exit without touching the brakes. I drove straight to the police station. The next day, my manager Dave pulled the security footage. They saw him waiting. They saw him chase me. The police issued a trespass order, banning him from every Walmart in the district. He actually tried to come back a week later, claiming he just needed milk, but the greeter recognized him and called the cops immediately. He was arrested for trespassing and harassment. I quit 2 weeks later. I couldn't stand being behind the register anymore. Every time a male customer smiled at me, every time someone gave me a compliment, I flinched. I realized that my politeness had been weaponized against me. I had traded my safety for the sake of not being rude. That experience changed me. It stripped away the social conditioning that told me to be a good girl, to smile, to be accommodating. It taught me that sometimes you have to be cold. Sometimes you have to be a bitch, because the alternative is being a headline. The price of memory. 90% of people believe their secrets are buried deep enough to never see the light of day. But they are dead wrong. Only 2 minutes from now, you will realize that some things aren't just hidden. They are rotting, waiting for the exact moment you feel safe to crawl back into your life. There is a specific kind of inescapable dread that comes when a secret you thought was dead begins to stir. I've spent years obsessed with these things, collecting the stories that others want to forget, the ones the legal system couldn't solve but the universe simply refused to ignore. My name is Elias, and I deal in the currency of forgotten things. Every time I sit at this desk, I feel a phantom knocking at the back of my skull. It's a literal physical sensation, a memory that bites back. I have a small, jagged scar on my left palm, a souvenir from a night I tried to bury a truth that didn't want to stay under. Every time the air turns cold, that scar pulses with a life of its own, reminding me that we are never truly alone in our silence. We are a global community of the haunted, bound together by a shared fear of what happens when the lights go out and the quiet becomes too loud to bear. Listen closely. Can you hear that? 3 sharp, rhythmic knocks on wood. It shouldn't be possible. I'm alone in this room, yet the sound is as clear as a ticking clock in a morgue. It's the sound of a debt coming due. It's the sound of the unsolved searching for a witness. For the next few minutes, you are that witness. You will see the shadows that the police reports left out and feel the cold breath of the inescapable on your neck. You might feel the sudden, prickling conflict of being watched right now, even in the safety of your own home. Don't turn around. Just listen. I often think about why we are so drawn to the dark. Is it because we recognize a piece of ourselves in it? Or is it because we hope that by witnessing the darkness of others, our own shadows might seem lighter? If you have ever felt that sudden chill in a warm room, or seen something move in your peripheral vision that vanished when you turned your head, then you are already part of this global community. You aren't just a spectator anymore. You are a participant in a grand, unfolding drama of justice and retribution that exists just beyond the veil of the mundane. Have you ever wondered about the crimes that go unpunished? I'm not talking about minor infractions. I'm talking about the rotting secrets that keep people awake at 3 a.m. There is a secret hidden in your neighborhood right now. Maybe it's the quiet neighbor who never talks about their past, or the abandoned house at the end of the block that everyone avoids without knowing why. These stories are the threads that make up the tapestry of our existence. They are the stains on the floorboards that no amount of scrubbing can remove. The unearthing has already begun. The rotting secrets of the past are pushing through the soil, and no amount of prayer can keep them down. We are moving toward a place where the law has no jurisdiction, where the only thing that matters is the weight of what you've done. Think about the physical weight of a lie. It sits in the gut, heavy and cold. Now imagine that lie taking shape, growing teeth, and coming to find you. That is what we are exploring tonight. Before we move into the first story, I want you to do something for me. Close your eyes for just 5 seconds. Can you feel the space around you? Is it truly empty, or is there a presence there, waiting for you to acknowledge it? If you feel a sudden urge to check the locks on your front door, do it now. Don't wait, because once we start, the door to these memories will be wide open, and there is no telling what might walk through. We are about to step into a world of unsolvable mysteries. These aren't just campfire tales. They are echoes of reality that have been distorted by guilt and time. I've seen the police files. I've walked the sites of these tragedies. I've felt the energy left behind, a residue of pain that never truly fades. It's like a radio station playing a frequency only the guilty can hear. And tonight, I'm turning the volume up. Think about the ticking clock. Every second that passes is a second closer to a reckoning. We spend our lives running from the inevitable, building walls of routine and normalcy to keep the chaos at bay. But the chaos is patient. It doesn't mind waiting years, decades even, for its moment. It waits until you are at your most comfortable, until you've finally convinced yourself that you got away with it. That's when it knocks. 3 sharp knocks. One for the lie, one for the victim, and one for the truth that cannot be silenced. I remember a woman who came to me once, shaking, claiming that her reflection was no longer hers. She said that every time she looked in the mirror, the woman looking back was a few seconds behind. Eventually, her reflection started to whisper. It told her things she'd forgotten, small cruelties, hidden greeds. It told her that it was tired of being the one behind the glass. Do you think that's just a story? Or do you think that every time you look in a mirror, you're looking at the version of yourself that remembers everything you've tried to forget? This is the price of memory. It isn't free. It demands to be held. It demands to be seen. If you try to push it away, it only grows stronger, feeding on your denial. We are going to look at 8 individuals who tried to run. We are going to see exactly how far they got before the shadows caught up to them. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find a piece of your own story in theirs. If you're enjoying this descent into the shadows, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It sounds like a small thing, but in this digital age, it's how we keep this community alive. It's how we signal to each other that we aren't alone in the dark. Leave a comment below with the time and place you're watching this from. Let's see how far these ripples of dread can travel. Are you in a quiet apartment in Tokyo? A lonely farmhouse in Kansas? A bustling street in London? Tell us. Let us know you're there. The first story we are going to explore involves a man named Julian. Imagine a prison gate. It's heavy, rusted, and groaning as it swings open. But this isn't an exit. Julian is standing there, clutching a paper sack of his only possessions, watching the world he abandoned 4 years ago. He thinks he's stepping into freedom, but he doesn't realize that freedom is just another kind of cage if you're carrying a heavy enough burden. Julian's release was supposed to be a fresh start. He'd done his time, or so the state thought. He walked out into the crisp morning air, smelling the exhaust of city buses and the faint scent of rain on hot asphalt. He felt powerful. He felt like he'd survived the worst the world could throw at him. But as he looked at the rideshare sedan waiting for him at the curb, he didn't see the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror. He didn't notice the way the car sat a little too low on its suspension, as if it were carrying a weight far greater than a single human. The driver was an older man, gray-haired, with hands that looked like they had been carved out of ancient oak, scarred, large, and steady. He didn't speak. He just nodded Julian into the back seat. Julian, still riding the high of his release, didn't think twice about the silence. He was used to silent men. He was one of them. He tossed his paper sack onto the floorboards and settled back, watching the prison walls recede. What Julian didn't know was that Silas, the driver, had been waiting for this specific day for a very long time. Silas didn't just pick up passengers. He collected debts, and Julian owed a debt that no prison sentence could ever cover. As the car pulled out into traffic, the child locks clicked. It was a small sound, a tiny metallic snap, but to Julian's experienced ears, it sounded like a gavel hitting a block. Julian tried to make conversation at first, a defensive habit. He asked about the weather, about the route, about how long Silas had been driving. Silas just pointed to the GPS mounted on the dash. The route was set, but as they drove, Julian realized they were moving away from the city center. They were heading toward the industrial outskirts, toward the abandoned lots and the places where the streetlights are few and far between. Julian's scars began to itch, the ones on his palm, the ones on his soul. He looked out the window and saw a burned-out gas station. It was a skeleton of a building, blackened by fire, the pumps rusted and leaning like tombstones. His heart skipped a beat. He knew this place. He knew the dumpster in the back. He knew the arrangement of the stars above it on a night 6 years ago. He felt a cold sweat break across his forehead. Why are we here? He didn't ask it out loud. He couldn't. His throat had closed up. Silas slowed the car to a crawl, then stopped in the middle of the cracked asphalt of the station's lot. He kept the engine running, a low, rhythmic thrum that sounded like a growl. Silas reached into the center console and drew out a manila folder. It was worn at the edges, the paper yellowed with age and frequent handling. He opened it and laid the first photograph on the passenger seat so Julian could see it. It was a crime scene photo. A girl. What was left of her after the fire. Julian's name was written in the corner of a police report tucked into the folder, a report that had never been filed. A report from a case that had been officially labeled unsolved. The fear Julian felt wasn't the fear of being caught. It was the fear of being understood. Silas looked at him in the mirror, then really looked at him. His eyes were like stone underwater, cold and immovable. He wasn't a vigilante. He was a father. And Julian was about to learn that the longest ride of his life wasn't measured in miles, but in the distance between a crime and its final, bloody reckoning. If you have ever felt that you escaped the consequences of your actions, if you think that time has washed away your sins, then pay close attention to Julian's story, because Julian is about to discover that the universe has a very long memory, and sometimes it sends a driver to make sure you arrive exactly where you belong. Don't go anywhere. The ride is just beginning, and Silas has many more folders to open. If you're feeling the tension, if you're wondering what happened at that gas station, stay with us. The truth is often more terrifying than the lie, and tonight, we are going to find every hidden piece of it. Julian is about to realize that the prison he just left was the safest place he'll ever be. The car is moving again, turning onto a dirt road that leads deep into a cornfield where the stalks are high enough to hide 1,000 secrets. Julian closes his eyes, but he can still see the photographs. He can still see the girl, and he knows, with a finality that echoes the grave, that there is no exit from this car. Not until the debt is paid in full. Are you ready to see what's in the next folder? Are you ready to witness the price of memory? Let's go deeper. Let's find out what Silas is really looking for. And let's see if Julian can survive a ride where the destination is his own soul. The ticking clock is getting louder. Can you hear it? 3 sharp knocks. It's time to face the shadows. Julian is about to learn that some confinement is eternal. And the driver? He's only just started. Stay tuned, because the next revelation is one you won't want to miss, even if it makes you want to look over your shoulder one more time. Only the truth can set you free. But in this car, the truth is a death sentence. Julian grips the seat. The car hits a bump, and the paper sack of his life falls over, spilling his meager possessions onto the floor. It's a mess, just like his life. And Silas? Silas just keeps driving. Don't wait. Don't look away. The unearthing is now. This is the global community of the haunted, and we are just getting started. If you think you know how this ends, think again. The universe always has a twist, and Silas is the master of the long game. Julian's ride is your ride. We're all in the car together. And the child locks? They're already engaged. There is no turning back now. We are heading into the heart of the mystery, and the only way out is through. Let's see what the shadows are hiding. Let's see what Julian is willing to do to survive. And let's see if you can handle the truth when it finally knocks on your door. 1, 2, 3. It's time. Julian looks out the window at the endless corn, and the car slows down. Silas turns his head. The first word he speaks is Julian's name, and in that one word, Julian hears his entire past, his entire future, and the sound of a door closing forever. Are you listening? Because this is where it gets real. This is where the price is paid. This is the unearthing of Julian, and you are the only witness he has left. Don't let him go alone. Follow us into the field. Follow us into the dark. The story is only beginning. The wrong fare. A convict's last ride. Julian had walked through the gates of the prison thinking the morning sun felt like an invitation to a new life. But freedom is a fragile concept when you've left a trail of blood in the dirt. He stood on the curb, his fingers trembling as they clutched a cheap paper sack containing the pathetic remnants of his former existence. A comb, a few crumpled bills, and a watch that had stopped ticking the day he was sentenced. The prison walls fell away behind him like a fever dream he was finally waking from. But he was far from awake. He was overconfident, leaning into the cool morning air with the arrogance of a man who believed he had outrun his own shadow. He remembered the judge's face, the way the gavel had sounded like a final door slamming shut, and for 4 years, he had replayed the moment he would walk out of those gates. Now that it was here, he felt invincible. He thought he had paid his debt to society, but society has a way of keeping the books open long after the state has stamped them closed. Silas was already there, waiting in a black sedan that looked like it had been washed with brackish water. Silas was an older man, his hair the color of industrial smoke, his face a landscape of weathered wrinkles and silent judgment. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't even look Julian in the eye. He simply tapped the dashboard, a signal for Julian to get in. Julian tossed his sack into the back seat and climbed in, his heavy canvas jacket feeling like an oven in the sudden humid heat of the interior. He wore that jacket to hide the jagged scars on his forearms, marks of a life spent in violence. But in the confined space of the car, the fabric felt like a shroud. The car smelled faintly of old peppermint and something sharper, a chemical scent that reminded Julian of a hospital wing or a morgue. He wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers tracing the rough texture of the canvas. Why was he wearing a winter weight jacket in this sweltering humidity? Because some things are better left covered. Even if you're burning alive underneath, the dialogue between them was non-existent. Silas pulled away from the curb with a surgical precision that made Julian's skin crawl. He watched the city begin to peel away, replaced by strip malls and abandoned lots held back by nothing but rust and chain link. Julian kept glancing at the phone mount. The GPS displayed a route that made no sense. "Hey, old man, you're taking the wrong exit," Julian muttered, his voice raspy from 4 years of silence. Silas didn't respond. He simply raised one gnarled finger from the steering wheel, a gesture that demanded patience, or perhaps signaled the end of it. Julian felt a prickle of irritation. He was Julian. He wasn't a man to be ignored. He reached forward to touch the screen, intending to reroute the trip, but Silas's hand shot out with the speed of a striking viper, catching Julian's wrist in a grip that felt like iron bands. The strength in the old man's scarred hands was impossible, terrifying. Silas slowly pushed Julian's arm back toward the passenger seat, his eyes never leaving the road. Panic began to pool in Julian's stomach when Silas took a sharp turn onto a county road lined with scrubland and drying corn stalks. The world outside looked theatrical, untrustworthy. They passed a burned-out gas station. Its canopy collapsed onto the concrete island like a broken spine. Julian felt his chest tighten. He knew this wreckage. He knew the way the stars looked through the smoke that night 6 years ago. The memory hit him like a physical blow, the smell of gasoline, the sound of a girl's pleading voice, and the heat of a fire that had never truly gone out in his mind. He reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The child locks were engaged. The click of the locks echoed in the silent car like a hammer hitting a nail. He was trapped in a moving cage with a man who drove like he had all the time in the world because, for Silas, time had stopped the moment his life was ruined. Julian began to yank on the handle, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Open the door. Let me out of this car right now." Silas didn't even flinch. He just kept his hands at 10 and 2. his gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun began to dip behind the cornstalks, painting the sky in the color of fresh bruises. Silas slowed the car and pulled into the blackened lot of the ruins. The engine continued to thrum, a low, rhythmic growl that vibrated through Julian's seat. For the first time, Silas turned in his seat and looked Julian directly in the face. His eyes were colorless, like water over stone, carrying a weight that Julian recognized from his own reflection in the prison mirrors. It was the look of a man who had been hollowed out by a singular obsession. Silas reached into the center console and drew out a manila folder, worn soft at the edges. With the methodical care of a surgeon laying out instruments, he began to place photographs on the passenger seat. He didn't rush. He seemed to savor the way Julian's eyes widened with every new image. Crime scene photographs, yellow tape, numbering markers beside evidence. Julian's breath came shallow and fast as he saw the first image a girl's face, or what the fire had left of it. Silas didn't speak, but the air in the car grew cold enough to miss Julian's breath. Silas picked up a printed document, a police report where Julian's name was highlighted in red ink that looked like dried blood. "They never connected you to this one," Silas finally spoke, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "The detectives were lazy. They saw a drifter and a fire, and they called it an accident. But I did the work. I spent months compiling the mathematics of your guilt. I mapped every stop you made that summer. I tracked the pawn shop records. I waited for the request on the app. I posted the fare and I waited for your name to pop up on my screen." Julian stared at the folder, his mind racing. How could this old man know? He had been so careful. He had burned the clothes. He had disposed of the phone. But Silas had found the one thing Julian couldn't hide. The pattern. The climax hit Julian like a physical blow when Silas held up a school picture. The girl was smiling, maybe 14 years old, her hair caught in a bright ribbon. Her name was Rachel, Silas said, his jaw working silently. "She was my daughter. She was supposed to be home by midnight. I waited on the porch until dawn. Do you know what it feels like, Julian? To watch the sun come up and realize that the world has ended while you were sleeping?" Julian tried to scream, but the words were trapped in his throat, choked by the realization of his own mortality. He looked at the driver, then at the child-locked door, then at the vast, indifferent cornfield stretching out beyond the windows. He realized then that Silas wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a judge. He was a force of nature, a consequence made of flesh and bone. Julian's overconfidence had evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal terror. He begged. He promised money he didn't have. He tried to explain that it was an accident, that the gas station fire had started by mistake. Silas just watched him, his expression unchanging, a mirror of Julian's own ruthlessness. "It's too late for stories, Julian," Silas said softly. Silas put the car back into gear, his large, scarred hands tightening on the wheel until the tendons stood out like cables. He wasn't taking Julian back to the city. He was driving deeper into the dirt tracks between the high corn, toward a remote corner where the insects hummed in the heat and the soil was hungry for a new secret. Silas shoved the car into drive and forced Julian to watch as they left the road behind, headed for a reckoning that had been 6 years in the making. As the car disappeared into the towering stalks, Julian realized that the ride was never about the fare. It was about the blood that was finally coming home to roost. The corn hit the sides of the sedan with a sound like whispering voices, mocking Julian's attempt at a fresh start. Silas steered the vehicle toward a clearing hidden from the road, a place where the air smelled of turned earth and copper, and Julian knew that his second prison was going to be much smaller than his first. The engine ticked as Silas finally cut the ignition. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream, a vacuum that sucked the air out of Julian's lungs. Silas leaned over and unlocked only the driver's side door, stepping out into the red light of the setting sun to wait for the predator to become the prey. Silas's shadow stretched across the windshield, a long, dark shape that seemed to swallow the car whole, while Julian sat paralyzed in the back, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal and the frantic thud of his own doomed heart. Silas tapped the glass with the manila folder, a final invitation to step out and face the ghost of Rachel in the tall grass. Julian looked at the handle one last time, knowing it was useless, knowing that the mathematics of guilt had finally reached their sum. The field outside was still, the wind having died down, leaving only the sound of the crickets and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the man waiting for him in the dirt. Julian opened the door, and as his boots hit the soft earth, he realized that for some people, there is no such thing as an exit, only a different kind of confinement. The corn seemed to close in around them, a wall of gold and green that blocked out the rest of the world, leaving Silas and Julian alone in the center of a tragedy that was about to find its ending. Silas reached into his jacket, not for a gun, but for a single match, and as he struck it against the manila folder, the flame reflected in Julian's wide, terrified eyes. The ride was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. Think about Silas for a moment. He is the physical manifestation of every consequence you've ever ignored. He is the person who remembers when everyone else has forgotten. If you've ever hurt someone and thought you got away with it, Silas is the shadow in your rearview mirror. He isn't interested in the law. He is interested in balance. And tonight, he is finally balancing the scales. If you're watching this and you feel a sudden chill, maybe it's time to ask yourself, who is driving your rideshare tonight? Because sometimes the destination isn't on the map. It's written in the things you've tried to leave behind. As Silas stands in that cornfield, watching Julian tremble, he isn't a monster. He's a father who has found his way home. And Julian is just another secret being buried in the dirt. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the darker side of human nature, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps us reach more people who need to hear these warnings. Subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss a ride with us. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like your past was catching up to you? What would you do if you found Silas waiting for you at the end of a long day? Let's talk about it. Let's build this community of the aware. Because in the dark, the only thing that keeps us safe is the truth. The car sits empty now in the clearing. The manila folder a pile of ash in the dirt. The sun has set, and the moon is rising over the Connecticut hills, casting a cold, silver light over the corn. Silas walks away, his footsteps steady on the gravel road, leaving Julian behind in a place where the insects will eventually go silent. The ride is done, the fare has been paid, and the world moves on, indifferent to the mathematics of guilt that were settled here tonight. But Silas finally sleeps. And you might want to check your locks one more time, because the next story is about to begin. And this one involves a place where the water never stops rising. Stay with us. The unearthing continues. Silas's sedan remains a dark stain on the landscape, a reminder that some crimes are too heavy to carry. The cornstalks sway in a sudden breeze, whispering Rachel's name to the empty sky. Julian's paper sack lies forgotten on the back seat, a collection of items that no longer have an owner. The watch inside has finally started ticking again, marking the seconds of an eternity Julian never saw coming. Silas doesn't look back. He knows that some destinations are final. He reaches the main road and disappears into the night, just another gray-haired man in the shadows, waiting for the next request to appear on a glowing screen. Are you ready for the next passenger? Because the road ahead is long, and the secrets are only getting deeper. 1 debt paid, 22 more to go. The brackish smell of the estuary is calling, and the confessional is waiting for a priest who has forgotten how to pray. Don't look away. The silence is about to be broken. The 23rd Soul, Confessions of the Drowned. As Julian's black sedan disappeared into the towering wall of golden green, the dirt beneath its wheels left a trail that would soon be washed away by a storm already brewing on the horizon. The reckoning in the cornfield had reached its silent, dusty conclusion, yet the heavy air of an unsettled debt seemed to drift eastward, carried by a wind that smelled of distant rain and brackish water. Guilt, as it turns out, has a very specific scent, one that doesn't easily wash out of the fabric of a soul. Far from that drying scrubland, in a town that felt as though it had been forgotten by the modern sun, the Church of St. Jude stood as a crumbling sentinel against the elements. Father Miller, a man whose 71 years were etched into his face like the cracks in the church's foundation, had not expected anyone that night. He was a man of habit, a man who found comfort in the predictable rhythm of the liturgy. But the storm had announced itself hours before the evening prayers, with a quality of light he associated with his childhood in Ipswich, a sickly yellow-green cast that made familiar objects appear theatrical and untrustworthy. It was the kind of light that precedes a disaster, the kind that makes you want to look over your shoulder even in a house of God. By the time he had finished his solitary supper of cold chicken and stale bread, rain was striking the rectory windows with a deliberate, rhythmic force, as though something outside were testing the integrity of the glass. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to check the locks on the heavy oak doors, a task he usually performed with mindless repetition. Tonight, the wood felt warmer than it should have, as if it were pulsing with a fever. Crossing the garden to reach the sanctuary felt less like walking and more like wading through a lightless sea. The bindweed had conquered the eastern wall over the years, and in the deluge, it looked like tangled limbs reaching out to trip him. Inside, the darkness of Street Jude's had a physical texture. Miller did not reach for the lights immediately. The church had been built in 1847 by a merchant who had lost his only son to cholera, and the architecture reflected a very specific, unyielding grief. There were too many narrow windows and columns that served no structural purpose other than to create hiding places for shadows. Above him, the ceiling was painted with stars that had, over decades, become mere gray ghosts against grayer plaster. A forgotten firmament for a forgotten man. But it was the smell tonight that unsettled him most. A thick, brackish odor that Miller could not account for. It wasn't the familiar must of old incense or the scent of damp stone. It was something underneath, something like cave air mixed with river mud or estuary silt. It was the smell of things that stay wet forever, things that never truly dry out in the sun. He paused in the nave, testing the air. It had a hint of salt and diesel fuel that felt entirely out of place. He thought for a moment of the Loon estuary, a place he hadn't visited in 40 years, and the thought made his hands shake. He wiped them on his cassock, but the dampness remained. Miller made his way toward the confessionals. The church possessed two, though only one had remained in use during his 23-year tenure. The other, nearer the altar, had been closed long before he arrived, supposedly due to a stubborn case of dry rot. Tonight, however, the functioning booth felt cold, not gradually, but suddenly, as if Miller had stepped into standing water. The air inside the small box was stagnant, heavy with the weight of decades of whispered sins. He settled onto the bench, hearing the wood groan in a way that sounded almost like a greeting. When the first penitent arrived, the man's voice was soft, shaped carefully as though he were speaking with an injured mouth. He introduced himself as Arthur and began a disturbing account of caring for his mother. For 15 years, he had maintained her routines, bringing tea, reading the wireless reports, adjusting her pillows only for a neighbor to eventually intervene and discover that the woman had been a corpse for over a decade. Arthur described the cadence of their one-sided conversations, how he had eventually begun to speak her parts for her, perfecting her tone and her habitual complaints until his voice and hers were indistinguishable. Miller listened, his heart constricting with a strange, adjacent pain. Arthur wasn't asking for forgiveness. He didn't believe he had done anything wrong. He simply needed someone to know how long she had been alone in the dark. Arthur's story was a mirror, though Miller wasn't ready to look into it yet. The man spoke of the smell of old teeth and mercy, words that seemed to linger in the air like smoke long after he finished. Before Miller could offer a word of counsel, the booth door clicked shut and Arthur was gone, leaving behind a lingering scent of something sweet and closed the smell of a room that hasn't seen the sun in a generation. Moments later, a second shadow darkened the lattice screen. This was Sarah, a younger woman whose voice carried an accent Miller couldn't place, something melodic yet fractured. She spoke of a car crash on the M6 highway, describing the smell of cleaning solution poured over decay. She told Miller she had woken up in a hospital that felt wrong, where the mirrors were too frequent and the lighting too dim. When she returned home, she found a thin, gaunt figure standing behind her in every reflective surface. Her bathroom mirror, the television screen, even shop windows. Her paradox was simple and terrifying. She believed the version of her that walked the world was a clerical error, a ghost or an echo pretending to be alive while the real Sarah was trapped behind the glass, pointing at her with an expression of pure grief. She had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, trying to make room for the mirror version to come back through. Miller felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Sarah's guilt, her survivor's guilt, was manifesting as a literal rejection of her own existence. She believed she was a mistake that needed to be erased. The conflict began to roar in Miller's ears. These weren't random confessions from the townspeople. He was hearing his own long-buried sins reflected in their accounts of isolation and distorted reality. His feet felt wet, though the floorboards beneath him were bone dry. The brackish smell intensified, bringing with it a sudden, sharp memory of a Tuesday in November 1984. He remembered the King's Arms pub, the forced laugh of a woman named Margaret he was trying to impress, and the arrogant certainty that he could drive the 2 miles home despite the 7 pints of lager. He remembered the rain striking the pub windows just like tonight. The climax arrived with 3 sharp knocks, not on the door of the booth he occupied, but on the long-sealed, dry-rot confessional near the altar. Miller approached the Victorian monstrosity, its wood carved with birds that had women's faces and trees bearing fruit like weeping eyes. He had been told for 20 years that this booth was dangerous, that the floor was unsound, but the knocks were insistent. He opened the door and settled onto the bench, which fit his frame with an alarming, inevitable perfection. It felt as if the wood had been waiting to hold him. Through the screen, he perceived a massive, broad-shouldered shape. A heavy, wet figure began to speak in a voice that sounded like the crushing weight of the deep, a sound like grinding stones under a tide. It was Thomas Halloran, the driver of the bus Miller had struck 40 years ago near Conder Green Road. Thomas didn't sound angry. He sounded disappointed, which was infinitely worse. "Confess," the figure commanded. The word hit Miller like a physical blow. As his throat closed around words that would not form, water began to seep upward through the floor of the booth. It wasn't rain. It was dark, thick, and tasted of diesel and estuary mud. Halloran described the impact, how Miller's green Vauxhall Cavalier had struck the front wheel, sending the top-heavy Pilgrim bus breaching through the barrier like it was made of wet paper. Miller saw it all again. The bus tilting, the headlights burning underwater like dying eyes, and the shapes moving frantically behind the glass as the cold water of the Loon estuary rushed in. He remembered his own hand on the gear shift, putting the car in reverse and driving away into the rainy night, telling himself a lie about a stray deer until the lie became his truth. The water in the confessional rose to his chest, then his neck. The booth seemed to expand into a cavernous, cathedral-like space where time became variable. Looking out through the open door, Miller saw that the pews were no longer empty. 23 figures sat in absolute silence, their clothes streaming with estuary water, their bluish faces turned toward the altar with patient expectation. He saw the elderly woman in the floral dress who had been singing a hymn when the water hit. He saw the young man with the rucksack. He saw the 2 children holding hands, and he saw a fellow priest, the chaplain who had been returning from a shrine in Lancaster, a man whose life Miller had indirectly claimed before taking up the collar himself. He realized now that his 40 years of ministry had not been a calling, but a penance he hadn't the courage to name. He had stayed in poor, drafty parishes like Street, Jude's to punish himself, offering absolution to thousands while believing he was a fraud. He had been a prisoner of his own forgetting. Thomas Halloran reached through the screen, his hand dripping with silt and the bitterness of the deep. "Now we can leave," the driver said, his face fragmenting into 23 different expressions of final realization. "We've been waiting for you to remember, to understand the weight of the lives you took for the sake of your own convenience. Someone has to stay in the bus to maintain the balance. Someone has to keep drowning." The golden shimmer of the souls began to fade, evaporating into the morning light as they were finally released from the cold water. Miller tried to stand, but his legs were paralyzed, pinned down by the weight of the estuary mud filling the booth. The water rose over his mouth, tasting of salt and old sins. The last thing he saw before the darkness closed over his head was the crucifix above the altar, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a symbol of salvation. He saw a witness who had been watching him run for 40 years. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the sky an aggressive, artificial blue. Mrs. Henley, the neighbor who had found Arthur's mother, was the one who discovered Father Miller. She had noticed the church doors standing open and found him slumped in the dry-rot confessional, his head tilted back against the panel. The doctor, a man who believed in clear causes and effects, signed the forms for a heart attack, common enough for a man of 71. But as the new priest, Father Okoro, arrived to modernize the parish, he found a single, tarnished metal disc on Miller's desk, next to a cold teacup. It was an old bus token from 1984, Lancashire United Transport, resting there as if it had just been placed as payment for a ride long overdue. Okoro had the old booths removed and burned, claiming they were uncomfortable and out of proportion. Yet, on certain November nights when the rain comes in hard from the west, he still hears the rhythmic, persistent sound of water dripping in a corner of the church that is perfectly dry. He noticed a patch of floorboards there that remains dark and damp, roughly the size of a kneeling man, regardless of the season. Okoro never stays in the sanctuary past midnight. He tells himself it's fatigue, the mind's tendency to create patterns in the dark. But deep down, he fears that if he sits in that spot and waits, 3 sharp knocks will sound on wood that no longer exists, and he will have to answer for the shadows he carries. He senses a hunger in the air, an echo of a secret that even fire cannot consume, a presence currently stirring miles away, in a room where the windows are painted black and the floorboards speak in a dead boy's voice. The cycle of the drowned and the haunted is far from over. It is merely shifting its gaze. Are you certain your own house is as dry as it seems? Or is the water already beginning to seep through your floorboards, waiting for your own confession? The bus is still sinking, and there is always room for one more soul to keep the balance. Don't close your eyes just yet. The unearthing is only moving to the next room. The hunger in the walls. Caleb's room. The heavy silence of street. Jude's, with its lingering scent of estuary mud and forgotten sins, seemed to settle into the very stones of the town. But miles away, another house was breathing with a rhythm that was far more predatory. Martha stood in the kitchen of her isolated farmhouse, her hand resting on the smooth, fever-warm wood of the doorframe leading to the stairs. She was a reclusive woman, a shadow, moving through a life built on a singular, desperate refusal to let go. Her son, Caleb, lived behind the heavy oak door on the second floor, a room Martha had sealed with black paint and thick velvet blackout curtains over 30 years ago. The ritual of the breakfast tray was her anchor. Chicken broth, bread without butter, and a glass of water with exactly 3 ice cubes. She counted to 10 before announcing his meal, her voice a paper-thin whisper that was always met by a low, vibrating hum from the floorboards beneath her feet. It wasn't the sound of a sick child. It was a predatory growl, a manifestation of a hunger that had been growing in the dark since 1995. The farmhouse had been a legacy from her grandmother, a place of high ceilings and deep, echoing closets that seemed to hold the cold, even in the height of summer. Martha often felt that she wasn't living in the house so much as serving it, maintaining the machinery of a life that had stalled decades prior. When Caleb was 7, the sickness had arrived like a thief. It began with a rash that wouldn't heal and a sensitivity to brightness that made the poor boy scream as if his skin were on fire. The local doctors were baffled, offering vague pamphlets about rare conditions like porphyria. But nothing worked. So, Martha did what any desperate mother would do. She built a world where the sun couldn't reach him. She painted the glass of his windows with unmarked cans of black paint and hung velvet curtains that smelled of funeral lilies. She became a ghost to protect a ghost. The conflict began in earnest when Elena, a young doctoral student in a bright yellow shirt, moved into the old Marsh house a quarter-mile down the road. To Martha, that yellow shirt looked like a small, mocking sun, a symbol of the vibrant, living world that Caleb had been denied. Elena was everything Martha had forgotten how to be: energetic, hopeful, and entirely too curious. She ran in the mornings, her curly brown hair bouncing against her shoulders, a sight that Caleb noticed immediately. From his sealed room, he began to describe her with a precision that chilled Martha to the bone. His voice, once the soft lilt of a child, was now a deep, grinding rasp that came through the floorboards. He knew when Elena ate, when her lights went out, and how the blue glow of her laptop made her look like she was drowning underwater. Martha begged him to stop watching, but the house itself seemed to pulse with his growing fixation. "She belongs to me," the wood whispered one evening, and Martha's heart nearly stopped as the plate she was washing slipped from her hands and shattered into the basin, the water smelling suddenly of old soap and wet earth. The drama escalated when Martha discovered the first set of muddy prints on the hall runner. They were adult-sized, with a deep, heavy tread that suggested a physical weight a sick boy shouldn't possess. The mud was dark as old blood, and smelled of the stagnant field behind the property, a place where nothing had grown for a generation. Martha spent hours on her knees scrubbing the stains until her knuckles bled, but the impressions remained, ghost-like and stubborn. The situation turned dire when Elena arrived at the door, her yellow shirt replaced by a shapeless gray sweater, her eyes red-rimmed with a terror that Martha recognized too well. Elena spoke of a shadow man standing at the foot of her bed, of waking up to find windows she had bolted shut standing wide open. Martha, trapped between maternal protection and a dawning realization of her own complicity, did the unthinkable. She looked Elena in the eye and told her she was imagining things. She used Elena's exhaustion against her, suggesting that the isolation of the marsh was playing tricks on her mind. She watched the young woman walk back across the dead grass, hunched under a weight that wasn't hers to carry. That night, the farmhouse finally dropped the pretense of normalcy. The floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned under the weight of something dragging itself across the ceiling. Martha climbed the stairs, her breath hitching in a hallway that felt narrower and colder than ever before. Caleb's door stood open, a dark, yawning mouth. The smell of copper pennies and rot was overwhelming, thick enough to taste. Inside, the blackout curtains were shredded into ribbons, and the black paint on the windows had been gouged away by long, frantic scratches, letting in the cold, indifferent starlight. The mattress was a ruin of exposed springs and 30 years of accumulated dust. Martha saw the shape, then tall, impossibly thin. Its shoulders set at impossible angles, standing where her 7-year-old boy's bed used to be. "You died," Martha whispered, the truth finally tearing through her skin like a jagged blade. "I buried you in 1995. The thing that wore her son's voice didn't deny it. It laughed, a wet, choking sound. It told her that she had made it this way, that every whispered apology and every plate of broth had been fuel for a grief that had developed a mind and a hunger of its own. The twist was a brutal, physical realization that hit her as she watched the shadow thing slide toward the stairs with a wet, dragging gait, heading for the marsh house to claim what it believed was its property. Martha realized that by refusing to let Caleb go, she had turned her love into a weapon. She grabbed the gasoline container from the shed, her movements practicing the same mechanical routine she had used for decades of care. She poured the fuel across the threshold of that cursed room, over the tattered velvet and the rotted bed, ignoring the high, terrified child scream that Caleb, the real boy, had made in her dreams. "I couldn't save you then," Martha sobbed as she struck the match. "But I can save her now." The house erupted in a sudden, violent, indrawn breath of fire. Wood split and nails pulled free as the structure that had held her prisoner for 30 years began to collapse. But as she ran across the field toward Elena's porch, her nightgown billowing with the heat of the inferno behind her, she saw the police lights painting the grass red and blue. The fire trucks arrived too late for the farmhouse, and the detective who met her later in a dingy motel room carried news that destroyed her final hope. They had found Elena's body in the tall grass behind Martha's property, her neck broken. The coroner determined she had been dead for at least 2 days, killed while Martha was still upstairs preparing trays and talking to the floorboards. The monster Martha had fed was real enough to murder, but it had finished its work long before she tried to burn it away. Martha sat on the thin motel bed, the smell of smoke and gasoline still clinging to her skin like a second soul, and realized the ultimate horror of her devotion. While she'd been downstairs maintaining her rituals, the manifestation of her refusal to let go had already claimed its prize. She had fed the darkness until it was strong enough to kill, but it was born of a belief that fire couldn't touch. Even now, in a small apartment above a pharmacy where there is no second floor, Martha hears the footsteps, back and forth across the ceiling, a space that doesn't exist in a building that shouldn't hold him. She wakes at 6 a.m. every morning, her hands already moving with the automatic grace of a woman who has no other purpose. She washes plates for 2, prepares broth for 2, and adjusts curtains that don't exist. She asks the empty gray air if he is hungry, and from the void above her, the shadow answers, "Yes, Mama." The cycle of feeding the hungry ghost continues, an immortal routine of maternal grief that refuses to die. It is a hunger that will eventually reach out for the next person who seeks quiet on the edge of town, just as a heavy mason jar is currently being unscrewed on a kitchen counter in a house that keeps its own kind of time. Have you ever felt a draft in a room with no windows? Or heard a floorboard creak in an empty hall? Perhaps it's time to ask yourself what you're feeding with your own secrets. Because once a hunger is given a name in a room, it never truly leaves. It just waits for the next meal. Don't look at the shadows for too long. They might start looking back, wondering if you brought the breakfast tray. The unearthing is just moving to the next floor, and the door is already unlocked. If you're listening to this and you feel a sudden, cold pressure against your own walls, don't ignore it. It's just the sound of a memory trying to find its way back into the light. Or perhaps it's just Caleb, waiting for you to tell him that everything is going to be all right. But we both know that's the biggest lie of all. Hit the like button if you've ever felt a presence you couldn't explain, and subscribe to join our community of the haunted. Tell me in the comments, what's the one thing you've refused to let go of? Let's talk about the weight of our burdens before they grow teeth of their own. The fire is still burning, but the cold is already coming back. Stay tuned, because the next secret is being kept in a jar, and the label has your name on it. One more story, one more dead. Are you ready to see what happens when the house finally stops breathing and starts eating? Don't close your eyes. The night is far from over, and the floorboards have so much more to tell us. Just remember, when the shadow asks if you're there, sometimes it's better not to answer. Mama's busy, and Caleb is very, very hungry. The unearthing continues. The preservationist. Jars of the vanished. The predator lurking in the floorboards of that farmhouse had spent 30 years growing teeth, fed by the desperate delusion of a mother who couldn't say goodbye. But some hungers are older and far more patient than maternal grief. While Martha was fleeing into the night, the weight of her belief finally collapsing into ash, another woman was stepping into a cage she had mistaken for sanctuary. Maya, known to the world as Nell, pulled her sedan to the end of a dirt road in rural Texas, the flat scrubland stretching out for miles like an unread map. She was running from a life that had become a series of rotted foundations, a failed marriage to a man named Derek, and a career that had felt like a slow-motion burial. The farmhouse she had rented was a simple white clapboard structure with a sagging porch, left fully furnished by owners who had reportedly disappeared in a family emergency. To Maya, it was a fresh start. To the house, it was a delivery. The first note of wrongness wasn't supernatural, but mechanical. At the back of the kitchen stood a door painted the same dingy white as the walls, but it was fixed shut with long pine boards and a violent X pattern. The nails were driven deep, splintering the frame as if someone had been frantic to keep the other side silent. Maya tried to ignore it, but the house held its breath in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. By the second day, the silence became too loud. She drove 40 minutes to a hardware store, bought a crowbar and heavy work gloves, and returned to face the boarded door. The physical struggle to pry the wood free was exhausting and visceral. Every time she wedged the crowbar behind a board, the house seemed to groan in protest. The nails shrieked a high metallic scream that set her teeth on edge and echoed through the empty hallway like a dying animal. The resistance of the wood felt personal, as if the door itself were clenching its jaw. When the last board finally snapped and fell to the floor with a hollow thud, the door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing a small room that smelled of bleach and absolute cold. Inside, Maya found the collection. Wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, holding hundreds of mason jars arranged with obsessive clinical precision. Each jar was filled with a clear liquid, and floating inside were the small, terrible remnants of the vanished. She moved the flashlight beam across labels written in careful cursive on masking tape. April 3rd, 1998. Fingernails, 4 of them, perfectly intact and curved, floating like pale crescent moons. June 17th, 1998. 3 small molars with roots still attached, bobbing in the fluid like tiny white boats. September 2nd, 1998. A thick lock of dark hair tied with thread, suspended like swaying seaweed in a tide pool. The chronology was a march of trophies, a library of lives reduced to fragments. Maya's hand shook as she realized these weren't just objects. They were the physical evidence of people who had simply stopped existing. A quick search on her phone confirmed her nightmare. Janet Hobbs, missing since April 3rd, 1998. Daniel Ortega, gone since June 17th. Every date on a jar matched a missing persons report in the Texas archives. The house didn't just have history. It had a stomach. The sheer clinical nature of the display, the absence of blood, the surgical cleanliness of the fragments suggested a predator that was both methodical and ancient. The tension reached a breaking point when Maya reached the highest shelf. The last jar was empty, clean, and waiting. The label was fresh, the ink barely dry. It bore the date, November 16th, 2025. Tomorrow. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Someone had prepared for her arrival long before she had even signed the papers. She turned to run, but her car was gone. The driveway was a blank slate of dirt. The scrubland outside the windows began to look painted, a theatrical backdrop that refused to let her pass. That's when Eli, the man who had supposedly foreclosed on the property, stepped out of the shadows of the kitchen. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by a duty he was too tired to carry. He carried a pair of flower-clipping scissors, their blades gleaming with a terrifying readiness. Eli didn't raise his voice as he explained the greater darkness. The house, he claimed, was a living entity, a barrier against a void that existed before light was made. If the house wasn't fed these small, preserved sacrifices, the darkness would bleed through and consume everything. It was a cycle of preservation to prevent total annihilation. The land is kinder than the house, Eli said with a sad, clinical detachment. It accepts what the house doesn't need. My wife, my daughters, they were the first. I tried to walk away, but you can't leave a house that knows your name. He described the nights when he tried to stop, the way the darkness outside would begin to press against the glass until the windows began to crack. He spoke of the mercy of the scissors, just a lock of hair, a single tooth, a small piece of skin, enough to satisfy the house's hunger for another season. The philosophical debate was short and brutal. Maya argued for morality, for the law, but Eli pointed to the windows. Behind the glass, the daylight was flickering, the sky turning into an impossible, lightless void that seemed to be eating the very stars. The house was already opening its mouth, and Maya could feel the temperature in the kitchen plummeting toward freezing. Eli explained that the previous owners hadn't fled. They had merely merged with the land once a new guardian was found. Maya tried to fight, but the house itself fought back. The deadbolt refused to turn. The windows felt like solid steel. She was trapped in the mathematics of the house's hunger. Eli approached her with the scissors, his eyes full of a kindness that was far more terrifying than cruelty. He took only a lock of her hair, whispering that it was better to give a little now than to lose everything later. He placed the hair in the tomorrow jar and tightened the lid. He was leaving, he said. He had maintained the preservation for 30 years, and now it was Maya's turn. The house will show you what it needs, he told her as he walked out the door that now opened easily for him. The ones who come after, they'll be running from something, just like you. You'll learn to spot them. The house has a way of calling to the broken. He didn't look back as he stepped out onto the porch and began walking toward the horizon, his form dissolving into the scrubland until he was nothing more than a memory. Maya watched him vanish until he was a dark point on the horizon. Then, nothing at all. She was alone with the jars, the cold liquid in them glowing faintly as the sun set. The house settled around her with a sound like a long-awaited sigh of satisfaction, the walls pulsing with a warmth that felt like a heartbeat. She sat at the kitchen table, her phone ringing in the silence. It was an unknown number. She knew, with a sick certainty, that the call was beginning the next loop. She answered, her voice steady and automatic, listening to the young, tired voice of a woman asking if the farmhouse rental was still available. Maya's fingers drifted to a clean, empty mason jar on the counter. Yes, she whispered. It's available. When would you like to see it? The cycle was complete. She was no longer Maya. She was the preservationist, the guardian of the jars, and she would wait for the next runner to arrive. This wasn't a choice. It was an inheritance of bone and glass. Think about the places you've lived. Have you ever felt a room that felt too small? Or a closet that stayed cold no matter how high you turned the heat? Maybe it wasn't the insulation. Maybe the house was just waiting for its turn. If you're watching this right now, take a second to look at your own pantry. Are you sure you know what's behind the jars in the back? If you find a date on a label that hasn't happened yet, it's already too late. Hit the like button if you've ever felt a house was watching you. and subscribe to join our community of the aware. We are the ones who know that some doors are boarded up for a reason. Tell me in the comments if a house told you that your sacrifice could save the world. Would you pick up the scissors? Or would you let the darkness in? There's no right answer. Only a series of jars waiting to be filled. Stay tuned. The causeway is just ahead, and the speaker at the toll booth is asking a question you can't afford to get wrong. The unearthing is now. Maya traces the rim of the jar, measuring the silence of the room, realizing that she is just another specimen in a much larger collection. The house is breathing, and it is finally, for now, satisfied. But tomorrow is coming, and with it, a new renter who thinks they've finally found a place to hide. They have no idea that the house doesn't hide secrets, it preserves them. Don't close your eyes. The night is long, and the jars have so many stories yet to tell. Are you ready for the next loop? Because the car is already idling, and the toll is higher than you think. One jar filled, one more to go. The preservation continues. The causeway loop, toll of the trapped. The heavy glass jars in the preservationist's pantry rattled with a rhythmic, metallic vibration that seemed to pulse directly from the earth itself, but miles away, the source of that vibration was far more mundane and infinitely more sinister. Victor adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather, while Sophia watched the odometer roll forward with the focused intensity of a condemned prisoner. They were driving across the Devereaux Marsh Causeway, a desolate 11-mile stretch of crumbling asphalt that felt like a bridge between the living world and an absolute lightless void. The wind outside carried the scent of rotting vegetation and brackish water. But inside the car, the air was thick with a different kind of decay. The slow, agonizing death of a partnership built on lies. Victor and Sophia weren't just lovers. They were architects of a massive insurance fraud scheme that had recently escalated into something much darker. Sophia believed they were heading toward a new life in Phoenix, a clean slate bought with blood money. She had been careful, or so she thought. She had spent months compiling documentation, making secret recordings, and preparing a narrative that cast Victor as the mastermind and herself as the grieving victim. The plan was simple. Once they hit the mainland, she would drop the dime, hand over the evidence, and walk away free, while Victor rotted in a cell for 20 years. But as the headlights carved two pale tunnels through the swamp fog, Sophia began to notice that the landmarks weren't changing. The first toll booth appeared like a concrete apparition in the middle of the road. It was a small, gray structure with a yellow and black striped gate arm and a single red light glowing above the payment slot like a bloodshot eye. Victor slowed the car, his movements precise and surgical. "I didn't know there was a toll on this stretch," Sophia whispered, her hand instinctively tightening on her purse. Victor said nothing. He reached into his Italian calfskin wallet bought with their stolen funds and fed a $5 bill into the machine. The gate arm lifted smoothly, and they drove forward into the dark. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The marsh looked identical on both sides. Black pools of stagnant water and cordgrass bending in the wind. Then, the red light appeared again. The same booth, the same gate. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs. "Victor, we already paid. Why are we back here?" Victor didn't answer. He simply paid again. And again. By the fifth loop, the repetition had stripped away the facade of normalcy. They were rats in a high-speed maze, and the cage was shrinking. The red light eyes seemed to grow brighter with every cycle, reflecting in the windshield like a judge's lamp. The cost of the toll began to shift in a terrifying way. At first, it was $5, then 10, then 20. But by the 10th loop, the machine stopped accepting cash. The small digital screen above the slot flickered, changing from a currency symbol to a single word: confession. Sophia felt a cold sweat break across her neck. The repetition was a psychological abrasive, wearing down her resolve. She looked at Victor, searching for a sign of fear, but his face was an unreadable mask of stoicism. "Victor, what is happening?" she pleaded. He only looked at the booth with the detached interest of an entomologist studying a dying insect. The conflict reached a fever pitch when the speaker on the booth finally crackled to life. It wasn't a human voice, but a synthetic, flat cadence that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Sophia's bones. "Why did you take the boat out that night?" the voice asked. Sophia felt her bladder loosen. She gripped the armrest until the vinyl groaned. "How does it know?" she hissed. Victor remained silent, his jaw working as he stared into the red eye. The booth wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a sensory interrogation. The smell of diesel fuel and salt water began to leak through the vents of the car, thick and suffocating. Every subsequent loop brought a sharper scalpel. "Did you purchase the rope before or after the policy was signed? What did you tell him about where you were going?" Sophia began to sob, the sound harsh and ugly. The breakdown of trust was total. She looked at Victor and saw a predator, a man who seemed entirely too comfortable in this purgatory. She wondered if he had known all along, if he was part of the machinery of this road. The paranoia began to bloom, a dark flower in the center of her mind. If Victor was silent, was it because he had already paid his toll? The drama hit its peak on what must have been the 100th loop. The voice asked, "How long have you been planning to betray him?" The silence in the car became a physical weight, pressing the oxygen out of her lungs. Sophia's tongue felt like a dead thing in her mouth, but the confession rose in her throat like vomit. "I was going to blame you," she screamed at the speaker, her face buried in her hands. "I have the recordings. I was going to let you rot so I could have the money. I'm a monster, Victor. I'm the one who did it. Is that what you want to hear? I confess. I confess to everything." The speaker went silent. The gate arm lifted one final time, and the road ahead finally stretched toward the lights of civilization. But Victor didn't drive toward the town. He turned onto a narrow service road that led to a dark, corrugated metal warehouse. The sudden silence when he cut the engine was absolute. "There was no boat, Sophia," Victor said, his voice flat and clinical. "And Colin isn't dead. He's my brother. He's inside that building right now, drinking coffee and watching the playback of every word you just said." The twist was a high-tech reveal that shattered Sophia's reality. Victor stepped out of the car and walked around to open her door, the child locks disengaging with a mocking click. He led her into the warehouse, where light spilled out, momentarily blinding her. Inside, the space was filled with monitoring equipment and glowing screens. Sitting at a desk was a man who looked exactly like Victor Colin Crowley. He was wearing professional-grade headphones, scrolling through a digital file of Sophia's recorded confession. The entire Causeway Loop had been an elaborate sting operation, a private road rigged with identical toll structures and high-output radio transmitters. "The loop never really ends, Sophia," Victor said softly, leaning over her as she collapsed onto the concrete floor. "You just won't see the toll booth anymore." He explained that they wouldn't turn the recording over to the police. A confession under duress was inadmissible. Instead, they were sending it to her previous victims, the other men she had destroyed and profited from. They were burning her new identity in Phoenix and exposing her offshore accounts to the authorities. They had studied her narcissism, her belief that she was the smartest person in the room, and used it to lead her right into the snare. The psychological impact was devastating. Sophia stood on the causeway an hour later, left behind as the brothers drove away. She looked at the horizon, but all she could see was the red light of the toll booth in her mind's eye. She realized that the toll would be collected for the rest of her life, paid in the currency of her own terror. Every relationship would be poisoned by the knowledge that she was being watched, studied, and judged. She was the architect of her own entrapment, a soul forever caught in a loop of her own making. Think about the way you walk through the world. Are you sure no one is watching? Are you certain that the silence of your partner isn't the sound of them taking notes? Sophia thought she was the predator, but she was just a specimen under a microscope. If you've ever felt that your life was a series of repeating mistakes, maybe you're already in your own loop. Hit the like button if you've ever felt the sting of a betrayal you didn't see coming, and subscribe to our community of the haunted. Tell me in the comments, how much would you pay to keep your darkest secret? As Sophia starts her long walk back to a world that no longer has a place for her, the unearthing is relentless. The night is long, and the loop is just beginning to tighten around her neck. Stay tuned. The next secret has 400 pairs of eyes, and they've all just turned to look at you, much like the way an ancient entity is currently testing the strength of its taxidermy prison in a house deep in the Alabama woods. Don't think for a second that your own past is behind you. The road is circular, and the gate is always ready to drop. One confession accepted, one life burned. The unearthing continues. The red light blinks one last time in the distance, a reminder that some debts are never truly settled. You might think you've escaped the loop, but the toll booth is always waiting just around the next bend. Are you ready to pay? Because the questions are only getting harder. One soul down, many more to go. The silence of the marsh is calling your name. Don't look back. Just keep driving, or at least try to. The gate is waiting. The synthetic voice is ready. And you're just another passenger in the long night of chilling lullabies. Sleep well, if the echoes of your own confession will let you. The unearthing is now. The loop is forever. And the toll is everything. Stop fighting. It's easier that way. They're all watching now. Every single one of them. Can you feel the weight of their gaze? Good. Then you're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to the end of the road. Let's see what else the shadows are hiding. One more story. One more secret. The night is just getting started. Don't go anywhere. The best is yet to come. Or the worst. It all depends on what you're hiding in your own manila folder. Silas is waiting. Thomas is waiting. Caleb is waiting. And now, Julian is waiting for you too. In the corn. In the dark. In the inescapable loop of your own mind. 1, 2, 3 knocks. Here we go. The unearthing of the taxidermist's secret is next. Are you brave enough to look into the eyes of Oleander? We're about to find out. Keep the light on, just in case. The taxidermy prison. The synthetic red eye of the toll booth blinked one final time in the rearview mirror as Sophia walked into a future where every shadow held the face of a brother she never saw coming. But miles away in the deep woods of Alabama, a much older watch was beginning. Julian, not the convict, but a young man carrying the heavy mantle of the Llewellyn name, watched the house reveal itself through a curtain of unrelenting rain. The Llewellyn place, as the tight-lipped locals called it, was a Victorian monstrosity that seemed to lean away from the forest as if recoiling from a secret. He had driven 7 hours to claim an inheritance from a grandfather he had never met, Emmett Llewellyn, a man who had spent 47 years in total isolation. As Julian fitted the heavy brass key into the lock, the door swung open to release a scent that would haunt him forever. A sharp, clinical cocktail of arsenic soap, borax, and formaldehyde. The smell was dense, clinging to the back of his throat like a physical residue, a testament to nearly half a century of preservation. The house was not a home. It was a museum of the dead. Over 400 taxidermy animals filled every available inch of the residence. A grizzly bear reared up in the entrance hall, its teeth yellowed and perfect. A mountain lion crouched on a walnut sideboard, muscles bunched as if preparing to spring. An eagle was suspended from the ceiling on invisible wires, its wingspan casting a permanent shadow over the floorboards. But it was the glass eyes that stopped Julian's breath, hundreds of them, crafted with such terrifying precision that they seemed to track his every movement through the rooms. He soon discovered the journals hidden in a locked cabinet, the key to which was tucked behind the glass eye of a mounted wolf. These weren't the notes of a hobbyist. They were the logs of a jailer. Emmett Llewellyn had spent 9 years hunting an entity he called Oleander, a fractured cosmic horror that fed on the moment of absolute helplessness. Unable to kill it, he had divided its essence into shards and bound each piece inside a vessel of fur and bone. Think about that for a second. Every animal in this house was a cell block. The grizzly, the mountain lion, the eagle, they were all tiny prisons holding a piece of a singular monster. Julian sat in the kitchen, the only room relatively clear of specimens, and read the journals until his eyes burned. He learned about the 9-year hunt that spanned counties, the livestock mutilations that were just a precursor to human disappearances, and the rituals that nearly killed his grandfather. It doesn't have a body, his grandfather had written in a shaky, fountain pen script. It has a hunger. I could not destroy it, so I gave it 463 cages. The conflict intensified as Julian realized the binding was weakening. In the dead of night, the scratching inside the walls wasn't mice. It was the sound of Oleander excavating the very skeleton of the house. The animals weren't just watching. They were moving. He would enter a room and find the grizzly bear shifted an inch to the left, or the foxes in the display case rearranged into a circle. The sensory experience became a nightmare of leathery rustles and the soft click of claws on wood. Gray, A voice called from the landing one night. It was his mother's voice, soft, hurt, and dead for 3 years. "Baby, let me in. He's hurting me." Julian stood with his forehead against the door, knowing it was Oleander using the voices of the people his grandfather had loved to lure him into breaking the vessels. The psychological siege was relentless. Every crow on the mantelpiece seemed to whisper in a syncopated harmony. Oleander tried to convince Julian that Emmett was the true monster, a torturer who had paralyzed animals while they were still conscious just to place the shards of the entity inside them. "You're continuing his work," the entity hissed through the mouth of a fan peacock. "You're a jailer of the innocent." Julian's guilt, inherited along with the house, began to weigh on him. He felt the isolation of the Alabama woods pressing in, the bars of the cell block animals closing around his own sanity. The climax occurred in the basement workshop, a space that smelled of ancient leather, copper, and something sweetly rotten. On the massive work table lay a wolf. It wasn't taxidermy from decades ago. It was fresh, its gray fur matted with dark fluid, its chest rising and falling in shallow, agonizing breaths. Yet, its body was cold as ice, and it didn't move. It was a physical impossibility, a creature caught in the overlap of life and binding, its yellow eyes wide with an intelligence far too old for its face. This was the final shard, the one his grandfather had never finished. Oleander offered a choice: continue the gruesome, blood-soaked rituals of blood and chalk, or allow the entity to merge with Julian, coexisting as a single mind. "I am tired of being fragmented," the entity whispered, the room dropping 10 degrees in a second. "I want to be whole. If you take me in, I will leave the world alone. I just want to feel the weight of gravity again. I want to taste the air." Julian looked at the wolf, whose breath was misting in the freezing air, and realized that the taxidermy prison was deteriorating. Within a year, the fur would rot, the bone would crumble, and Oleander would be unleashed in a frenzy of 47 years of repressed rage. Standing in a circle of ground chalk in his own blood, Julian chose a path his grandfather had been too proud to take. He performed the final binding ritual, not to the animals, but to himself. As he spoke the ancient, jagged syllables that hurt his throat to pronounce, the 463 vessels in the house began to smoke. Ribbons of shadow poured from the grizzly, the lion, and the birds, flowing like black water across the floor and into Julian's chest. The agony was transformative. He felt the grizzly's strength settle into his bones, the eagle's sharp vision burn behind his eyes, and the fox's cunning thread through his mind. He felt the entity's consciousness settle into his marrow like frost, the weight of 1,000 deaths expanding his mind until he could see the structure of reality, the spaces between spaces. He didn't become a monster. He became the living prison. He could feel Oleander's curiosity as it felt the movement of his fingers, its fascination with the simple act of drawing breath. They were bound together until the day he died. The house is quieter now. 6 months have passed, and Julian has moved most of the animals to the basement. They are just mounted specimens again, hollow and purposeless. He sits in his grandfather's study, surrounded by journals, sharing a consciousness with something that shouldn't exist. He has chosen his burden, and he carries it with a sense of purpose he never found in his old life. If you're watching this right now, take a look at the decorations in your own room. Are you sure they're just objects? Do they stay exactly where you put them when you turn your back? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below if you've ever inherited something that felt a little too heavy. Hit that like button if you think Julian did the right thing, and subscribe to Chilling Lullabies to stay part of our community. Your interaction helps us keep these shadows from fading away. The phone on the desk rings. It's a detective from Choctaw County, asking about disappearances from the late 72nds. Julian feels Oleander stir with interest, a warmth like winter sunlight in the back of his mind. The entity is a patient teacher, and Julian is a quick study. They decide, together, to meet her. The truth will be complicated. But as Oleander whispers, the world doesn't always reward honesty. Julian stands and looks out at the woods, which have grown closer to the house in the last few months. The wrongness his grandfather created is still there, but now it has a guardian who understands the cost of the watch. Don't go anywhere. The night is reaching its deepest point. While Julian prepares for his meeting, a man in a city apartment is currently staring at a family photograph. realizing that his own smile in the picture has just changed. The unearthing is moving into the urban sprawl, and the next door is already opening. Stay with us. The unearthing continues. Julian flexes his hand, feeling the entity's approval vibrate through his skin. They are balanced. They are whole, and they are ready for whatever comes next. Are you? Because the next story is about a man who thought his life was his own until he found his double living in apartment 14C. One soul bound, one life duplicated. The unearthing is now. Don't look at the mirrors. You might not recognize the person looking back. Sweet dreams, if you can still dream at all. The eyes are watching, and they're finally, for the first time in 47 years, seeing everything. The better version. Replacement in 14C. Julian Llewellyn had chosen his burden, merging his spirit with a cosmic hunger to preserve a world that would never know his sacrifice. But as he settled into the silence of his grandfather's study, another man was discovering that his own quiet sanctuary had become a laboratory for his replacement. Gerald Keller returned to the Meridian Arms at precisely 6:47 p.m., just as he had for the last 8 years. He was a man defined by the cold, predictable logic of actuarial tables, a person who found safety in the meticulously ordered arrangement of his life. His existence was a masterclass in risk management. He knew exactly how many steps it took from the elevator to his door, and precisely how many grains of sugar belonged in his evening tea. But tonight, as he stood before apartment 14C, the lock didn't resist his key. The door was already slightly ajar, a gaping violation of his fundamental rules. Gerald entered with a frown, his mind immediately leaping to mundane explanations. A faulty latch, a draft from the hallway, or perhaps an unannounced inspection by the building superintendent. Yet, as he moved through the living room, a subtle, creeping wrongness began to itch at the back of his mind. Everything looked correct. The burgundy armchair caught the dying sunlight, and his Architectural Digest magazines were stacked in their chronological towers. But when he went to the kitchen and stirred his instant coffee, the spoon felt wrong. It looked like his spoon, down to the small dent in the bowl from prying open a paint can years ago, but its weight was off by a fraction of a gram. The balance shifted in his palm, feeling artificial, like a stage prop designed to look real from the audience, but lacking the soul of the original. The coffee tasted exactly like the cheap brand he always bought, yet the ritual felt like a rehearsal performed on a set that was slightly out of scale. He looked at the dish towel hanging by the sink. The terry cloth had the right texture, but it carried a faint scent of a laundry detergent he had never used. Something floral and aggressive that smelled of another person's preferences. The conflict escalated when Gerald examined the photographs on his mantelpiece. He looked at his own graduation portrait and felt a jolt of genuine terror. The man in the frame wore his face, his crooked smile, and his stubborn hair, but the eyes were different. They held a confidence, a predatory clarity that Gerald had never possessed. He checked his parents' wedding photo next. His father's boutonniere was pinned to the wrong lapel, a detail so minute it made his stomach turn. It was the uncanny valley brought home. He was living in a replica of his life that was 99% accurate, but that final 1% was where the horror lived. He felt like an intruder in his own skin, a ghost haunting a life that had been subtly edited while he was at work. Driven by a desperate need for reality, Gerald slipped back into the hallway. He began to pace the corridor, his feet following the familiar rhythm of his own gait, but his mind was fracturing. Then he saw it. A second nameplate just down the corridor, apartment 14D. It read G. Keller in the exact same cursive script. He pushed that door open and found his actual home, the one where the photos matched his memories and the spoons felt heavy with the weight of his own history. The air here smelled of his generic detergent and stale crackers. But as he stood in his real kitchen, he heard his own footsteps approaching from the hallway. He hid in the bedroom, pressing his back against the wall, and watched through the crack of the door as his doppelganger entered. The imposter was a better version of himself, the Gerald too. This man moved with a straighter posture, his shoulders back, lacking the actuarial stoop that Gerald had developed over years of hunching over spreadsheets. The double had a charismatic smile that Gerald only ever practiced in the privacy of his bathroom mirror, but could never quite pull off in public. The man measured the coffee with a casual, effortless grace, looking entirely more at home in the apartment than Gerald ever had. It was a terrifying realization. The world wouldn't miss the real Gerald. because the replacement was an improvement in every measurable way. The psychological warfare began when the imposter spoke to the empty room, his voice carrying the exact resonance of Gerald's own vocal cords but infused with a warmth that Gerald lacked. "You found it, didn't you, Gerald? I expected you to be faster, honestly. Your obsession with detail is your only redeeming quality." The double stepped into the bedroom doorway, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light with a polished gleam. He explained with chilling detachment that he had been practicing for months. He had attended Gerald's work mixers as a cousin, studied his emails, and spent hours in the fake apartment 14C refining a version of Keller that was simply more efficient. "I'm not stealing your life," the imposter said with a smile that felt like a surgical incision. "I'm liberating you from this boring cage. I can do more with your name in a week than you've done in 40 years. I'm the Gerald you were always too afraid to become." The drama reached its peak when the telephone on the nightstand rang. It was his sister, Dottie. Gerald listened, paralyzed, as his double answered. The conversation flowed with an intimacy that Gerald had never managed to achieve. Dottie laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that Gerald hadn't heard in years. She told the imposter how much she preferred this new, relaxed version of her brother and how glad she was that he was finally coming out of his shell. Hearing his only family choose the fake over the real was the final break. He realized the imposter had been talking to her for weeks, laying the groundwork for Gerald's permanent disappearance. If the real Gerald called her now, she would think he was the prankster, the mentally ill brother who had finally snapped. But as Gerald watched the double preen in the mirror, he noticed something. The imposter was a creature of data and performance. He was perfect because he was following a script. He lacked the messy, unpredictable failures that defined a human soul. Gerald realized that his own flaws, his social anxiety, his hesitation, even his stoop, were his only armor. They were things that couldn't be quantified or perfectly replicated because they were born of real pain, not a rehearsal. He decided right then to fight back. He wouldn't vanish into the anonymity of the liberation plan Eli or the others had suggested. He would stay in the shadows of the Meridian Arms and become the ghost in the machine. He began to formulate a plan to out Gerald the double, to use his deep actuarial knowledge of his own past failures to trip up the man who only knew how to be a success. He would be the one wrong detail in the imposter's perfect life. Gerald Keller walked out of the real apartment while the double was in the shower, slipping back into the fake 14C. The air in the building felt different now. He was no longer a victim. He was an investigator of his own existence. He looked at the wrong spoon and smiled. He would wait for the double to make his move, and then he would strike where perfection is most vulnerable, at the heart of the lie. The unearthing of his identity had begun, and Gerald Keller was finally ready to live, even if he had to kill a better version of himself to do it. Think about your own life for a second. Have you ever felt like you were just going through the motions? Like anyone could do your job or talk to your family just as well as you do? That's the fear the imposter feeds on. But Gerald is proving that your better version isn't you, it's just a shadow without a soul. If you're watching this and you feel a sudden urge to check your own family photos for a different eye color, don't ignore it. Hit the like button if you've ever felt like an outsider in your own life, and subscribe to Chilling Lullabies to see how Gerald's duel with himself ends. Tell me in the comments if you met a perfect version of yourself. Would you step aside? Or would you fight for your flawed reality? The city lights flicker outside the window of 14D, and a man in a dark coat walks across a Connecticut hillside toward a house that holds an even older bargain. The unearthing is moving toward its final tower, where the living and the dead are about to settle the ultimate account. Stay with us. The unearthing continues. Gerald watches the elevator floor numbers descend, knowing that when the doors open, he has to be the best version of himself. Not the perfect one, but the real one. One identity contested. One more bloodline to be secured. Are you sure you're the only person living in your head? Or is there a replacement just waiting for you to leave the door ajar? The night is almost over, but the secrets are only just beginning to speak. 1, 2, 3 knocks. It's time for the Ashcrafts to answer. Don't look away. The unearthing is now. We're moving to the final chapter, where the price of a name is higher than anyone ever imagined. Liam is waiting at the gates of the Ashcraft estate, and the lady of the house is already reaching for his hand. Are you ready for the final revelation? Because some secrets don't just rot, they hunger. Let's go to the hill. The unearthing is coming home. 1, 2, 3. Here we go. The final story starts now. Don't close your eyes. You won't want to miss the ending. It's time to find out what really lives beneath the stones of the mansion. The unearthing is final. The unearthing is you. Have you ever wondered why certain objects feel heavy even when they are small? Why a grandmother's ring or an old pocket watch found in an attic makes the hair on your arms stand up? The biggest secret, the one that keeps the mortuary business booming and the psychiatric wards full, is that the objects we cherish most are the primary conduits the dead used to find us. Those heirlooms, those keepsakes, those goodbye gifts tucked into silk-lined caskets. They aren't memories. They are anchors. The dead have no physical hands, so they use yours. They find an object that was present at the moment of their final agony, a moment of intense energy, and they latch onto it like a leech. When you bring that object into your home, you aren't just bringing in history. You are bringing in a homing beacon. You are inviting the uninvited to dinner. Let me show you what I mean with a case that redefined the word haunting for me. Not long ago, in a town that shall remain nameless, a small, antique, silver lighter was discovered tucked inside the inner drywall of a local funeral home. It shouldn't have been there. It was found by a man who lived in the narrow gaps between the bricks. A man named Silas, who thought he was the only predator in the building. Silas had spent 23 months living inside the Blackwood mortuary, watching the living grieve through the slats of heating vents. He thought he was invisible. He thought he was safe. He found the lighter during a routine harvest. He would lower a monofilament fishing line through the vents to snatch small items left in the caskets. Saint medals, letters, watches. But this lighter was different. It had been pulled from the pocket of a man who died in a chemical plant explosion in Quincy. A man who had been reduced to charred remains. The lighter was inscribed with the initials J.C. and a phrase that should haunt your sleep. In flame forever. When Silas picked it up, it wasn't cold like metal should be in a drafty wall. It was hot. Not sat in the sun hot, but a deep, vibrating heat that felt like it was trying to pulse through his skin and fuse with his marrow. It was the heat of a memory of fire that refused to go out. Silas tried to drop it, but his fingers spasmed shut. The metal didn't just burn, it bonded. He didn't drop it. He couldn't, because once you touch something that belongs to the uninvited, the molecular boundary between you and them begins to blur. You might call it a phantom heat, a trick of the nerves, but it's actually the first stage of the hollow process. The object is measuring you. It's checking to see if you have enough room inside for a new tenant. If you're listening to this right now, I want you to do something. It's a simple test, but it might save your life. Open your dominant hand. Press your thumb firmly into the center of your palm. Do you feel a faint, pulsing warmth there? Not the beat of your heart, but a steady, radiating heat that feels slightly out of sync with your own body? If you do, don't panic. But don't look behind you either. We are about to dive into 7 accounts of the fractured and the lost. These aren't just accounts, they are blueprints. They show you how the transfer happens, how a person becomes a vessel, and how a secret can be buried for 50 years only to crawl back out through a radio frequency. If you stop listening now, you are choosing to remain blind in a room full of things that can see you perfectly. You are choosing to ignore the rustle in the closet and the wet, labored breathing under your bed. Do you think your locks protect you? Do you think the 4 walls of your apartment are solid? Ask yourself, when was the last time you checked the space inside your walls? Silas thought he was the king of that narrow world, but he was just a guest. The real owners were finally coming home, and they didn't need a key. Take a breath. If it feels a little heavier than the last one, that's just the time of resolution taking effect. Your world is getting smaller, and the shadows are getting louder. The first tale involves a man who learned that in the house of the dead, there is no such thing as a truly empty space. One such space was the Blackwood mortuary, where Silas was about to learn that some items are better left buried with their owners. Silas was a shadow, a ghost among the living, but he was about to discover that even the walls have eyes, and they were all fixed on the silver lighter he now held in his trembling hand. I want you to imagine Silas for a moment. He's crouched in a 6-inch gap between drywall and brick. He's learned to make his breathing shallow, to compress his rib cage like paper so the spiders don't even notice him. He spent nearly 2 years perfecting the art of being narrow. but the lighter is changing the math. The lighter is making him expand. He looked down at his palm where the silver J.C. lighter lay. The skin was blistering, but there was no smoke. The heat was internal. It was as if the man from the chemical plant explosion, the one the assistant said needed dental records to identify, was trying to use Silas's body to finish a cigarette he'd started 50 years ago. And then came the sound. Not from the viewing room below, not from the hallway. It came from the ductwork, a wet, dragging sound. The sound of meat being pulled across a butcher's block. Silas pressed his eye to a gap between the studs and saw a hand emerging from the vent. Not a human hand. A charred, skinless claw of bone and tendon reorganized to fit through the narrow slats. It was reaching for him. It was holding a white envelope. You see, the dead don't just take. Sometimes they offer a trade. They give you what you think you need. Money, power, a second chance. But they always leave the bill on the nightstand. In that envelope was $52,000. But when Silas touched the bills, he realized they weren't made of cotton. They were made of chemically treated human skin. Are you still holding your palm? Is it getting warmer? If you want to know how Silas ended up becoming the very fuel he tried to steal, or how a man named Leo woke up in a hospital with titanium plates in his head only to find he was no longer the only person living in his brain, then you need to stay. Don't click away. Don't look at the comments yet. The hollow thrives on your distraction. If you stay, I will show you the 6 windows of the Sorrow Pines cabin and the basement that shouldn't exist. I will tell you about room 417 and the roommate who folded herself into a closet. This is your only warning. The veil is at its thinnest. The stories are starting. And by the end, you'll be checking your own reflection to see if your eyes still reflect the light in the same way. Let's begin with Silas, the man who thought he could live in the spaces between, and found out that the spaces between were already occupied by something that had been waiting for him to arrive. Every story I'm about to share is a piece of a larger puzzle. A puzzle that, once completed, describes the exact shape of the thing currently standing in your hallway. Don't believe me? Listen to the way the floorboards creak when the house settles tonight. That's not the wood expanding. That's the weight of the uninvited. Now, let's go back to Blackwood. Silas is staring at the skin currency in his hand. The smell of gasoline is filling the narrow crawl space. His camping stove won't light, but his palm is screaming with fire. He's about to realize that some inheritances aren't written in wills. They are written in flame. And once you accept the gift, you become the guardian. Are you ready to see what Silas saw? Are you ready to hear the final radio check from the fire tower? Then don't move. Don't breathe. Just listen. The price of curiosity is high, but the price of ignorance is much, much worse. Welcome to the time of resolution. Welcome to the truth. Silas was just the beginning. In the mortuary, the shadows were shifting. The assistant director, Mr. Carty, was walking down the hall, his footsteps rhythmic and heavy. Silas could hear the heartbeat of the man below, but he could also hear a second heartbeat, one that was coming from the silver lighter itself, a fast, frantic thumping that matched the rhythm of a heart in its final seconds of life. Silas gripped the lighter, and for a moment, he wasn't in the wall. He was in the fire. He was the fire, and that's the trick, you see? The dead don't just want to be remembered. They want to be you. They want to feel the air in their lungs again, even if those lungs are stolen. Silas was narrow. Silas was thin, but he wasn't empty enough. Not yet. The fire would take care of that. It would burn away the parts of him that were Silas, until only the vessel remained. If you've ever felt like you weren't quite yourself after losing a loved one, if you've ever found yourself doing things they used to do, speaking in their cadence, using their favorite phrases, you might want to check the objects in your house. You might want to ask yourself if you're still the one driving. We're going to move now from the funeral home to the mountains of Harlan County. We're going to look at Leo, a man who thought a hiking accident had taken his memory, but who was actually being rewritten from the inside out. He thought he was a survivor. He was actually an invitation. Stay with me. The next story is about to start, and you don't want to be in the dark when it does. Unless, of course, the dark is where you feel most at home. If that's the case, then you and I have a lot to talk about. Silas found the lighter. Leo found the mountain. What have you found that's currently waiting for you to fall asleep? Let's talk about the cold. Not the cold of winter, but the cold of a presence. The kind of cold that makes your breath fog in a room that's supposed to be 68 degrees. That's the first sign. Silas felt it in the walls. Leo felt it in the hospital. You might be feeling it right now. If the temperature in your room just dropped, don't reach for a blanket. Reach for the light, but be careful. Sometimes the light just shows you what you've been trying so hard not to see. Silas saw the hand. Leo saw the mirror. And you're about to see the whole truth. 7 stories, 7 warnings, 1 resolution. Let's go. Silas is in the wall, and the fire's starting to spread. Not to the building, but to his soul. And as he burns, he understands the final lesson. The dead don't leave. They just find new places to hide. I've seen this happen in every corner of the globe, from the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest to the humid swamps of Louisiana. It's always the same. A moment of weakness, a moment of greed, or a moment of pure, accidental curiosity. You pick up the wrong stone. You open the wrong door. You stay in the wrong room. And suddenly, you aren't the only one in the house. I remember a woman in Seattle who bought an antique vanity mirror. She said she liked the character of the wood. Within a month, she was speaking in a language she'd never learned and drawing maps of a town that burned down in 1902. She thought she was going crazy. I told her she was just being filled. The vanity wasn't a piece of furniture. It was a guest list. This is what happens when we don't respect the boundaries. We think we can own the past, but the past has a much firmer grip on us. Silas thought he was the one fishing for treasures, but he was the one on the hook. The dead man in the casket was just the bait. Are you starting to see the pattern? Every story I tell is a mirror. If you look closely enough, you might see yourself in one of them. You might see the moment you made your own invitation. Maybe it was a ring you found on a beach. Maybe it was a house you bought because the price was too good to be true. Maybe it was just a choice to stay on a mountain after the sun went down. Whatever it was, you're here now. And being here means you're ready to hear the rest. Silas is just the opening act. The real horror starts when the person in the story looks like you, when the room they are trapped in looks like the one you're sitting in, when the wet, labored breathing you hear isn't coming from the narrations, but from the corner of your own bedroom. Don't look yet. We have 6 more stories to get through. And by the time we reach the fire tower, you'll know exactly what to do when you smell smoke in a rainstorm. You'll know why the scarecrow in the field isn't stuffed with straw. You'll know why the roommate in room 417 was so obsessed with hollowing you out. The time of resolution is here. The light is hitting the static just right. Silas is disappearing into the flame, and Leo is waking up to a heartbeat that isn't his. These are the fractured and the lost, and their stories are yours now. Keep your hands flat. Feel the heat. And whatever you do, keep listening. Because the only thing worse than being haunted is being haunted in the dark without a map. I'm Elias, and I'm your guide through the hollow. We've established the price of curiosity. Now, let's see what happens when you actually pay it. The Blackwood mortuary is fading, and the Harlan County Medical Center is coming into view. Leo is looking at his reflection, and for the first time, he's noticing that his eyes don't reflect the room. They reflect the woods. Are you ready to see what Leo sees? Are you ready to understand the wet rhythm of the blood? Then let's move. The veil is open. The uninvited are waiting. And the next story is the one that changes everything. Don't say I didn't warn you. The price is paid. The resolution has begun. Keep in mind, as we move forward, that these accounts are not isolated. The man in the funeral home, the survivor on the mountain, the group in the cabin, they are all connected by a single thread of intent. They are all being harvested, and the forest is the threshing floor. I once met a man who claimed he could hear the trees talking. He said they weren't speaking in words, but in memories. They were retelling the stories of everyone who had ever died under their branches. He said the forest was a giant recording device, and if you stayed long enough, you'd eventually hear your own death being rehearsed. He was found a week later, perfectly still, his skin turning to bark, his eyes gone to sap. He hadn't died. He'd just been filed away. That's the risk we take. We think we are observers, but we are actually content. We are the data being recorded. And tonight, I am playing back the tape. 7 stories, 7 warnings, 1 truth. Let's talk about the Hollow one more time before we move to Harlan. Being hollow isn't about being empty. It's about being prepared, like a glass waiting for water, like a room waiting for furniture, like a body waiting for a soul. Silas was hollowed out by greed. Leo was hollowed out by trauma. Maya was hollowed out by a roommate who knew exactly where to cut. What about you? What has hollowed you out? Is it a loss? A secret? A fear that you're not enough? Whatever it is, that's where they'll start. That's the crack they'll use to pry you open. And once they're in, there is no such thing as an eviction. So, as we go into the story of Leo and the stolen skin, I want you to ask yourself, how much of you is actually you? And how much is just the accumulation of things you've picked up along the way? Because on that mountain in Harlan, Leo found out that his own history was the very thing that made him vulnerable. His own memories were the invitation. Listen to the wind outside. Does it sound like the wind, or does it sound like a name being called? Silas thought he heard his own name in the fire. Leo thought he heard his friends in the woods, but it was always the same voice, the voice of the uninvited, asking for a seat at the table. We're moving now. The mortuary is a memory. The hospital is the present, and the mountain is waiting. The time of resolution is moving at a pace you can't control. The static is thickening. The heat in your palm is steady. Are you still there? Good. Because the next 5 minutes are going to be very important. If you can make it through Leo's story without looking in a mirror, you might just have a chance. But if you find yourself drawn to your reflection, if you find yourself checking the angles of your own jaw, then you're already part of the harvest. I'm Elias. I've been through the woods and back. I've seen the basement under the concrete, and I've smelled the smoke in the fire tower. I'm telling you this because I have to. Because the dead need witnesses, and the living need warnings. Silas is gone now. He's part of the Blackwood walls, a permanent part of the architecture, still holding that silver lighter in a hand that will never be cold again. And Leo is just beginning to realize that the Leo everyone knows is currently lying in a shallow grave under a pile of pine needles. The transition is complete. The stage is set. Let's look at the skin I wear. Let's look at the Harlan fracture. And let's hope that your own identity is a little more secure than his was. Because out here, in the time of resolution, your name is the only thing you have left to lose. Before we continue, I want you to remember Silas's final thought as the fire took him. He didn't think about his life. He didn't think about his family. He thought about the trade. He thought about the $52,000 made of human skin and realized that it was a down payment. The dead hadn't given him money. They'd given him a mortgage on his own existence. Don't accept the gifts. Don't pick up the lighter. And whatever you do, don't look for the basement. Now, look at the light. See how it's changing? That's not the sun setting. That's the veil tearing. The next tale is about to begin. It's the story of a man who woke up as a miracle and realized he was a catastrophe. It's the story of the Harlan fracture. Are you ready? The radio is crackling. The smell of smoke is faint. The heat is in your palm. Let's go. I want to remind you that if you're finding value in these warnings, if you feel the weight of these truths, then share this with someone who thinks they're safe. Subscribe to the silence. Like the darkness, let the community of the Hollow grow. Because there is strength in knowing we aren't the only ones being watched. Comment below. Have you ever felt the phantom heat? Have you ever found an object that felt like it was alive? Your stories are the data that helps me map the woods. Your experiences are the signals that help me triangulate the threat. Share them before you forget. Before the Hollow takes the memory. Now, hush. The mountain is calling. Leo is waking up, and the truth is about to be revealed. The ceiling tiles in the Harlan County Medical Center had water stains that looked like continents he couldn't name. Leo had been studying them for hours. He was mostly titanium now, the doctor said with a smile. Mostly metal and plates and screws. But as he looked at the reflection in the window, he realized that the titanium was the only thing holding the Leo shape together. Everything else was starting to flow. Let's look at the skin. Let's look at the mimicry. Let's look at what happens when the predator forgets to take off the coat. This is story 2. This is the Harland fracture, and this is why you should never hike alone after the time of resolution. Stay close. The forest is deep and the night is long. But as long as you can hear my voice, you aren't lost. Not yet. Silas made his choice. Leo is making his. What will yours be? The radio is hissing. The static is singing. The veil is gone. Welcome to the Harland fracture. Silas's fire has become Leo's cold, and the transition is as seamless as a knife through silk. Let's begin. The Narrow Man, shadow of the mortuary. The molecular bond between a man and a curse is forged in the silent, suffocating heat of a funeral home's inner wall. You might call it a phantom sensation, a trick of a mind left too long in the dark. But as the shadows of the Blackwood mortuary stretch across the floorboards like grasping fingers, Silas knows the absolute truth. He doesn't just inhabit the building, he has become a structural necessity, a living, breathing ghost feeding on the debris of the departed. He's the secret occupant, the one whose rent is paid in the lingering echoes of the dead and the stolen keepsakes of the grieving. Silas had learned to make himself narrow, not just thin. There was a fundamental difference that one only discovered when living in the 6-inch gap between drywall and brick, where the insulation hung in gray-pink strips like flayed muscle. In this cramped, dusty world, the air tasted of ancient lime, industrial chemicals, and the dried bodies of mice. He had trained his shoulders to compress, his joints to click into unnatural alignments, and his ribcage to fold inward like origami. His breathing had become so shallow, so deliberate, that even the spiders spinning their webs in the total darkness failed to notice his presence. For 23 months, he had been the uninvited tenant of the Blackwood mortuary, existing as something between a human being and a parasitic element. He was weight-bearing, silent, and necessary in the same way mold is necessary to old, decaying buildings. He was the rot behind the beauty, the truth behind the satin. His primary tool was monofilament fishing line, 20-pound test, transparent as spit when he lowered it through the intricate geometric patterns of the heating vents. This was his umbilical cord to the world below. At the end of the line was a treble hook smeared with pine sap he'd scraped from the building's exterior trim. It was sticky enough to catch on fabric, on the delicate gold chains of necklaces, or the cool, polished metal of watches and rings. The families mourning in the viewing rooms never saw the line descend from the ornate brass grills in the ceiling. They were too busy weeping, too consumed by their rehearsed performances of grief and the crushing weight of their own mortality to notice a slight tremor in the air 6 feet above the corpse. They looked at the face of the dead, while Silas looked at the pockets. Silas lived by a strict, almost religious set of rules to ensure his survival. Never hit the same room twice in a week. Never take something a family member might notice immediately. No wedding rings still warm from living fingers, those carried too much weight, too much active attachment. He sought only the goodbye gifts, the things people slipped into jacket pockets or folded into cold hands at the final moment when the funeral director turned his back. Saint medals, love letters, photographs that would have burned with the body anyway. Taking them felt like a kind of mercy to him, a preservation of the soul's leftovers. The dead didn't need keepsakes where they were going, but Silas needed them to keep his own humanity from dissolving entirely. They were his currency, his proof of existence in a world that had forgotten his name. The viewing room on the second floor was his favorite hunting ground. It had high ceilings and exceptional acoustics, acting as a natural amplifier that allowed him to hear approaching footsteps from 30 feet away. The vent was positioned perfectly above the head of the casket. Families always put the best gifts near the face, the seat of the identity. A daughter would tuck her father's favorite pipe into the breast pocket of his suit. A widow would slip her husband's dog tags beneath the pillow. Silas would wait, watching through the slats, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like a cat's, until the room was empty. Then, the fishing line would dance. On a Thursday in November, the air inside the walls changed. He knew it was Thursday because the crematory ran on Thursdays, and he could smell the faint, oily smoke of progress rising through the shafts. It was a heavy, sweet scent that signaled the finality of his neighbors. Through the vent slats, He watched the assistants wheel in the body of a man who had died in what they whispered was an industrial accident, a massive chemical plant explosion out in Quincy. It was a mess, they said. The heat had been so intense they'd had to use dental records just to put a name to the char. From his position in the wall, Silas could only see fragments. A slice of the polished mahogany rim, the dead man's left hand, and the skin, an odd, mottled gray that looked more like stone than flesh. But then, the overhead lights caught something silver tucked deep in the corpse's jacket pocket. He waited with the patience of a predator until the building settled into its afternoon quiet. The furnace kicked on, a deep metal groan that traveled through the ductwork, making the insulation quiver against Silas's back. It was a comforting vibration, the heartbeat of his mechanical host. He unspooled the line slowly, watching the hook descend through the geometric aperture, down past where the man's chest would be. Lower. The hook swayed in the warm air rising from the body, a warmth that shouldn't have been there. Contact. He felt the telltale catch as the sap found purchase on metal. Silas drew the line up hand over hand, the monofilament opening fresh cuts across the old, thick scars on his fingertips. He welcomed the pain. It meant he was still real. As the object emerged through the grill, Silas caught it in his palm. It was an antique silver lighter, rectangular with a hinged lid. Engraved on the side were the initials, J. Below them, a phrase was etched in a script so deep it seemed to vibrate against his skin. In flame forever. The metal was warm, not body warm, but warmer than that, almost hot to the touch. Even though the corpse below had been refrigerated for days, Silas thumbed the wheel to check the flint. The mechanism moved with a resistance that suggested it had been used recently. Often. Then, without warning, his palm began to burn. It wasn't a visible burn, but a phantom heat so intense he gasped, his fingers spasming open in a reflex he couldn't control. The lighter clattered onto the plywood floor of his crawl space with a sound like a gunshot. The burning sensation vanished instantly, leaving only a bone-deep ache, the kind of lingering throb that follows severe frostbite. He stared at the silver casing. In the dim, filtered light from the vent, he thought he saw a faint tremor in the metal itself, as if something liquid and heavy was moving inside, breathing. He pocketed it tentatively and withdrew deeper into his nest, a sanctuary made of a sleeping bag stolen from a donation bin and a plastic crate filled with expired protein bars. He added the lighter to his lockbox of treasures, arranging it beside a platinum band he'd taken from a banker the previous spring. The lighter belonged here, he told himself, with the other things people thought they'd take to the other side. That night, the temperature in the Blackwood mortuary dropped to an impossible localized low. Silas woke to his own breath clouding in front of his face, a white fog in the darkness. The furnace ran constantly in November, yet the air inside the wall cavity was freezing. He pressed his hand against the drywall. The surface was cold enough to make his skin stick to the paper. He reached for his camping stove to find some warmth, but the striker sparked without producing a flame, even though the fuel canister was nearly full. The liquid inside sloshed, but the fire refused to manifest. Then, he heard it, a wet, dragging sound from the vent directly below his head. Something was moving in the viewing room. Not footsteps, no heel-to-toe rhythm, but something much heavier and more fluid. It sounded like meat being pulled across a butcher's block. Silas, driven by a terror he hadn't felt in 2 years, pressed his eye to a gap between two wooden studs. The emergency exit sign over the door cast everything in a sickly, monochromatic red. The casket was still closed, its mahogany lid gleaming like dried blood, but something stood beside it. The shape was fundamentally wrong, too tall, too thin, its limbs swaying slightly like kelp caught in a deep-water current. It had the proportions of a man, but the posture of something that had forgotten the mechanics of how human beings stand. Its arms hung too long, brushing the floor, and its head was tilted at an angle that suggested a neck broken and never set. It was looking directly up at the vent. It was looking directly at Silas. He held his breath until his lungs screamed, his heart slamming against his ribs like a bird in a cage. When he finally dared to look again, the room was empty and the red light was still, but the scraping sound had moved. It was now inside the ductwork. Something was climbing the ventilation shaft, the sound of bone on steel echoing through the metal lungs of the building. Silas scrambled backward, pressing himself into the fiberglass insulation, the needles biting into his skin. A hand emerged through the grill in his crawl space. It wasn't a living hand. The skin was entirely gone, only charred black bone and exposed. Weeping tendon remained, the fingers ending in ragged nails that looked as though they had been filed down on raw concrete. The hand groped blindly in the darkness, then began to squeeze through the brass slats. The bones compressed, reorganizing themselves with sickening, wet cracks to fit the narrow gap. The wrist followed, then a forearm of dark red-brown muscle that had been cooked until it glistened wetly in the faint glow of Silas's phone. The hand held a thick, pristine white envelope. It pushed the envelope across the plywood toward Silas with a purposeful scrape, then withdrew back into the shaft. Gone. Silas waited for 5 full minutes, his breathing coming in jagged hitches, before he dared to touch the offering. Inside the envelope were stacks of hundreds and fifties, at least $50,000. But as his fingers brushed the currency, he recoiled. The money felt wrong. It was oily to the touch, stiff and unnaturally smooth, like it had been coated in a fine layer of wax or grease. He held one bill to his phone's light. The watermark was there, the security strip was present, but the smell was unmistakable and overwhelming. Sulfur and gasoline. It was the exact smell of the basement prep room after they drained the bodies. It was the smell of a final, violent transition. He tried to ignore the wrongness, stuffed the money under his sleeping bag, and told himself it was just the stress of the walls. He needed that money to be real. He needed to stop being narrow and re-enter the world of the living. But over the next few days, the cold followed him. It returned every night at midnight, sharp and demanding. He began to notice the smell of gasoline on his own skin and the follicles of his hair on his stolen clothes. The money's wrongness was contagious, a slow-acting poison. On the 4th night, the silence of the mortuary was broken not by a sound from below, but by the soft, mechanical click of the silver lighter opening inside his lockbox. Silas took it out, the engraving in flame forever, catching the red glow of his heater's pilot light. He decided he had to know. He had to test the bills. He held a $100 bill in his left hand and the silver lighter in his right, his hands shaking so violently the metal rattled. As he thumbed the striker wheel, the cold in the crawl space turned to absolute ice. He brought the small flame toward the corner of the paper. The moment the heat touched the air near the bill, the money screamed. It wasn't an imagination or a trick of the wind. The bill produced a high, keening wail that seemed to vibrate from within its very fibers. Silas tried to drop it, but the paper adhered to his skin like a magnet. The oil on the paper fused with the natural oils of his hands, creating a chemical bond. He watched in frozen horror as the bill began to curl and separate into translucent layers. It wasn't cotton, and it wasn't wood pulp. It was skin, thin, chemically treated sheets of human skin, printed with the faces of founding fathers and the hollow promises of legal tender. The bill ignited, but the flame was thick and viscous, moving like liquid napalm. It stuck to his fingers, spreading up his palms with a white-hot intensity that didn't consume the flesh beneath but bonded with it at a molecular level. He was becoming the wick. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of a fire that had no smoke. The insulation around him shriveled and pulled back like living tissue. Silas reached for the envelope to throw the rest of the currency away, but his fingers sank into the remaining bills as they dissolved back into their base components, skin and chemical fire. The flames leaped across his wrists like gloves of light. He stumbled through the narrow cavity, leaving glowing prints of flame on every stud and brick he touched. The lockbox melted, his gold watches and rings running like molten wax. The fire jumped to his face, coating his cheeks with the consistency of burning honey. In that final, agonizing moment of clarity, Silas understood the fundamental law he had broken. Theft always costs something, not in the abstract sense of morality, but in the concrete physics of a haunted universe. You cannot take things from the dead without giving a piece of yourself back. Every ring, every watch, every medal he had fished for had been a transaction he hadn't authorized. It was a trade he thought was one-sided, because the dead couldn't speak to collect. But they had been waiting, calculating the dead. This was the curse. The silver lighter held the memory of an eternal, unquenchable burning that could be transferred but never extinguished. The sorcerer in the mahogany casket had carried this agony for decades, and now Silas had stolen the anchor. He had accepted the fuel. He had signed the contract and skin. He was burning his way out of the walls now. Driven by a pain that had no ceiling, he threw his entire weight against the drywall, his burning shoulder punching through the plaster and paper like it was wet, scorched cardboard. He tumbled into the second-floor hallway, leaving a man-shaped hole of white fire behind him. The smoke detectors wailed, and the sprinklers activated, but the water only turned to steam upon touching him. It couldn't extinguish a fire that didn't need oxygen to breathe. This fire fed on the agreement he had made when he touched the silver lighter. He could feel his skin trying to regenerate, trying to heal beneath the flames, only to be immediately consumed again. An endless, horrific cycle of destruction and renewal. He collapsed at the bottom of the grand staircase, a charred, twitching heap. Through the flickering flames coating his eyes, he saw the viewing room door swing open. The casket was open. The body inside the gray, mottled man from the explosion was sitting up. Silas watched as the charred flesh on the corpse's hands turned pink, soft, and whole. The blackened features of the dead man's face smoothed out, the eyes opening to reveal a clear, unburdened blue. The dead man climbed out of the casket, his movements stiff at first, but rapidly becoming fluid. The chemical burns and the eternal heat had been transferred. The debt was settled. The formerly dead man walked past Silas without a second glance, pushed open the heavy front door of the Blackwood mortuary, and stepped out into the cool, dark November night, finally released into the stars. Silas remained on the floor, the fire filling his throat and lungs. The silver lighter was still in his pocket, glowing with a soft, inviting warmth, waiting for the next person to find it. In the wall, the monofilament fishing line still hung from the ceiling vent, the treble hook swaying slightly in the rising heat, waiting for the next narrow man to reach for a treasure he couldn't afford. Silas's fire was a new lighthouse, a beacon for the hungry. And soon, another soul would be drawn to the glow. But the world moves on, and while Silas burned, a different kind of survivor was waking up in a sterile hospital bed miles away, realizing that the titanium plates in his skull weren't the only thing that had changed during his time on the mountain. Leo was looking at his hands, watching his fingers bend in ways that should have been impossible, unaware that the fracture in his mind was about to reveal a predator that had forgotten how to be human. The skin I wear. The Harlan fracture. The transition from the scorched silence of the mortuary to the sterile, electric hum of a hospital room is as seamless as a knife through silk. The fire that consumed Silas was an ending, a final settlement of a stolen debt. But for the man now staring at the ceiling of the Harlan County Medical Center, the heat has been replaced by a localized, pulsing cold that suggests the fire was only the first stage of the transfer. The ceiling tiles above him are a map of an unknown world, water stains forming continents and archipelagos he cannot name, floating in a vast, gray ocean of medical static. He has been studying them for what feels like hours, or perhaps days. Time in this white room is not a line, but a series of overlapping circles, punctuated only by the persistent, sharp tang of antiseptic that reminds him of absolutely nothing at all. A woman in blue scrubs stands beside his bed, a clipboard clutched to her chest. She had been talking for a while before he realized she was there, her voice a distant drone like an insect trapped against a window pane. She tells him his name is Leo. She says he is in the Harlan County Medical Center and that he's been there for 3 days following a catastrophic accident on Harlan Peak. The name Leo means nothing to him. He tries the syllables silently, moving his tongue against the roof of his mouth. But the shape of the word feels wrong, as if his mouth were a slightly different size than it should be, or as if he were a mimic learning to speak a human language for the very first time. When he reaches for his memories, he finds only a vast, gray blankness, television static given physical dimension. And underneath that static, something else, something ancient, heavy, and undeniably hungry that moves in the dark. No, he managed to say. The word comes out like a rasp of gravel over concrete, a sound that makes the nurse flinch ever so slightly. She makes a quick note, her face a mask of practiced, professional sympathy. She explains that amnesia is a common byproduct of severe head trauma, a protective mechanism of the brain. She tells him his skull had fractured a spiderweb of cracks across the left temple and that the surgeons had essentially rebuilt his head using titanium plates. "You're mostly titanium now," she says with a nervous little laugh, but the smile doesn't reach her eyes. "Mostly metal, mostly reinforced." He touches the heavy, stiff bandage on his left temple, and for a fleeting moment, he feels a spark of heat underneath, not from the wound, but from the metal itself, as if the titanium were a tuning fork, vibrating in sympathy with a frequency only he can hear. But the real changes aren't the ones the surgeons made. They are sensory, deep, and terrifyingly sharp. He can hear things he shouldn't be able to hear. He can hear the heartbeat of the nurse, a wet, rhythmic contraction that sounds like heavy boots stepping through thick mud. He can hear the rush of blood through the chambers of her heart, a complex, roaring machinery of being alive that fills the white room with a noise so intrusive he wants to cover his ears. And underneath the noise, he feels a flicker of an instinct he doesn't recognize, a sudden, sharp craving for something raw, not the salted cardboard of the hospital meals, but something steaming and vital. The detective comes the next day. Her name is Miller, and she carries the weight of a woman who has spent 30 years looking at the worst parts of humanity. She shows him photographs from a campsite on Harlan Peak, vivid, oversaturated images of a blue pickup truck against a backdrop of jagged rock and pine. She points to the second man from the left, a dark-haired youth with an easy, confident smile. "That's you, Leo," she says. Then she names the others: Tyler Moss, Brandon Collins, Ethan Whitaker, your friends. He studies the face in the photo, looking for a spark of recognition, but it might as well be a picture of a stranger, except for the eyes. When he looks at the eyes of the man called Leo, he feels a tightening in his chest. Not grief, mimicry, a sense that he is looking at a blueprint rather than a reflection. "Where are they?" he asks. Miller's expression remains flat, her eyes tracking every twitch of his facial muscles. "They didn't make it off the mountain," she says. The words should have shattered him. They should have triggered a landslide of human emotion. Instead, he feels only that tightening again, and a sudden, crystalline memory of fresh meat cooling in the mountain air. He says he is sorry because it seems like the only acceptable human response. But as he speaks, he catches his reflection in the hospital window. For a split second, less than a heartbeat, he sees his reflection smile a wide, predatory grin while his own face remains neutral. He blinks, and the reflection matches his exhausted stare again. "A trick of the light," he tells himself. "A trick of the titanium." As he begins to move for the first time, he realizes his body feels like a suit that doesn't quite fit. His legs feel too long, his joints clicking with a mechanical precision that the surgery doesn't fully explain. He is learning how to look human, one deliberate movement at a time. He practices his stride in the hospital hallway, adopt the posture of the orderlies, mirroring the specific hitch in their shoulders and the rhythm of their steps. It has become a compulsion. He sees someone gesture, and his own hands twitch, wanting to recreate the motion exactly, as if his nervous system were a radio tuning into the broadcast of how to exist in the world. He is a predator trapped in a broken shape, trying to remember the rules of the skin he wears. The high-tension arc of his recovery leads to a forced session with Dr. Eris, a psychologist who specializes in traumatic displacement. Her office is a gallery of watercolors, gentle depictions of the very mountains that haunt him. "Leo," she says, her pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. "I want to talk about the perspective in your dreams." He tries to explain how he is running through the woods, but the perspective is wrong. Too wide, too low to the ground. The trees rushing past at a speed that doesn't match a human stride. He describes how he can smell the copper and salt of fear, how he saw one of the campers fall from behind, saw his own hands reach out, but they weren't hands. They were reaching pale things with too many joints, something designed for tearing rather than holding. Dr. Eris nods, her pen scratching rhythmically. She explains that trauma survivors often project their guilt into predatory archetypes, creating a psychological barrier between the self and the event. But as she speaks, Leo stops listening to her words and starts listening to the wet rhythm of her pulse. It is accelerating. She is nervous. She is looking at his hands. He looks down and sees that his fingers are lengthening. the knuckles clicking like small, organic locks being opened. The titanium plates in his skull begin to hum with a frantic heat. He forces his hand still, gripping the arms of the chair until the wood groans, the predator inside testing the boundaries of the Leo shape. The drama explodes when Detective Miller returns, her footsteps echoing with a finality that cuts through the antiseptic haze. She isn't carrying photos this time. She's carrying a crime scene report. The forensics came back from Harlan Peak, she says, her hand resting near the butt of her sidearm. The medical examiner said the damage to the bodies was consistent with a large predator, but the pattern was impossible. The tracks we found, they were multiple different sizes. Each print was a different depth, like something was trying on different pairs of shoes to see which ones fit. She leans in close, her eyes reflecting the cold fluorescent lights. And we found a fourth body, Leo, burned beyond recognition in a clearing that never caught fire. But the dental records were conclusive. The fourth body, it was yours. The heat from the titanium plates in his skull reaches a white-hot peak. The fracture is healing. And with the closure of the bone, the barrier between the stolen persona and the thing from the peak is dissolving entirely. The fourth body, he whispers, the gravel in his voice deepening into a sound that no human throat should be capable of producing. It was Leo's. The memory hits him then, not as a dream, but as a total, physical inundation. He hadn't been Leo. He had never been human. He was the nameless thing that lived in the limestone crevices of the mountain, a hunter that flowed from form to form like liquid. He had circled the campers for 3 nights, learning their scents, their voices, their fears. He had taken Tyler first, then Brandon, then Ethan. He had saved Leo for last, because Leo was the strongest, the one with the most life to steal. But Leo had fought back. In a moment of desperate, primal terror, Leo had swung a heavy branch, cracking it across the hunter's skull in the exact microsecond of transformation, a moment when the hunter was neither one shape nor the other. The impact had created a titanium-level fracture in the very machinery of change, trapping the predator inside the prey's skin. He had stumbled down the mountain wearing Leo's face, drowning in Leo's stolen memories, the crushing grief for a mother lost to cancer, the easy beers with friends, the mundane, small human life. He'd become the survivor who didn't survive, a monster walking around in a suit made of its victim's history. He was the Harlan fracture, a biological error held together by medical science. Now, sitting in the office, he feels the edges of the Leo shape beginning to fray and peel like old wallpaper. He looks in the mirror on the back of the door. The face is Leo's, but the eyes are wrong. They reflect light at an angle that suggests a double pupil, a hunger that can no longer be satisfied by saline and silence. His fingers begin to stretch again, the knuckles clicking in a rapid-fire sequence of bone reorganizing itself. He forces them back into a human grip, the effort feeling like he is trying to hold a bursting dam together with his bare hands. He has to decide. He can let the healing complete, let the shape fall away, and return to the formless dark of the mountains, or he can try to hold on. He thinks about Leo's uncle, Hugh, who calls every single day to say he loves him. He thinks about the warmth of that love, a sensation the hunter has never known. He chooses to stay. He chooses to be the vessel. He drives back to Leo's apartment, the steering wheel feeling fragile in his hands. His phone vibrates on the seat beside him. Uncle Hugh flashes on the screen. He lets it ring twice, using those precious seconds to summon Leo's voice from the depths of the stolen marrow, matching the particular cadence and the soft, human hesitation. "I'm here, Uncle Hugh," he says into the phone. And for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he actually believes it. He is Leo. He is the miracle. He is the sole survivor. But as he talks about dinner in the spring, he catches his reflection in the rearview mirror, underneath the skin. The predator is still watching, patient as stone, waiting for the titanium to cool so it can finish the harvest. Guilt is a foundation that can never be truly poured flat. And as he grips the phone with fingers that are just a fraction too long, he knows that, miles away, 4 other friends are driving toward a lonely cabin in the pines, unaware that the very ground beneath him is about to reveal a basement that doesn't exist. He is learning to smile, but the mirror knows the truth. Some survivors are just the uninvited, waiting for the right moment to take off the coat. Think about that the next time you look at a photo of yourself. Are you sure the eyes looking back are yours? Or are they just a pair of shoes that fit particularly well? Subscribe if you want to know what happens when the skin finally stops fitting. And comment below if you've ever felt like your own reflection was a second late to the mirror. We are moving now from the mountain to the Sorrow Pines, where a group of friends is about to discover that some rituals don't just remember the dead, they invite them back to finish what they started. The Harlan fracture was just the first layer of the hollow. The next story involves a basement, a rug, and a secret that has been breathing under the floorboards for 20 years. Are you ready for story 3? Then keep the light on, because the windows in the Sorrow Pines cabin are about to become mirrors, and you won't like what's looking back. The 6th window. The ritual of regret. The transition from the titanium-enforced survival on a jagged mountain peak to the eerie, breathless air of the Sorrow Pines is a descent from physical trauma into the psychological abyss of a collective ritual. If Leo was a man losing his skin to a predator, then Clara, Elena, Sarah, and Marcus were about to learn that guilt isn't just a heavy feeling you carry in your chest. It is a physical foundation that can be dug up with your bare hands. Guilt is the ultimate invitation. A hollow space within the soul that acts like a key turning in a lock that was meant to stay sealed for eternity. Have you ever felt like a secret was actually a physical weight under your floorboards? Most people call it a metaphor. In the Sorrow Pines, it's the blueprints. They had been driving for 6 hours. The silence in the rental car, heavy enough to have its own mass, its own gravity. The cabin had not improved with age. If anything, it had developed a kind of organic hostility, a gray interruption among the pines that seemed to watch their approach through windows that reflected nothing but the dark silhouettes of trees. 20 years had passed since the night Rachel Mitchell died. Yet, as Marcus pulled the car to a shuddering stop, the order in which they stepped out was the same as it had been during their senior year. Clara and Sarah together, Elena and Marcus following their footsteps, crunching on the gravel in a rhythm that felt like a rehearsed performance. The patterns of their friendship had reasserted themselves like a muscle memory they had desperately tried to forget, but the body remembers what the mind tries to bury. Clara noticed the 6th window first. She stood in the damp gravel, counting them slowly, her finger tracing the air. 1, 2, 3, 6. There had always been 6, and yet the math felt fundamentally wrong, as if the house had grown a new aperture specifically to observe their return. They had come here for a memorial, a way to finally lay Rachel to rest and move on with their adult lives. But the atmosphere in the Sorrow Pines suggested that Rachel had never left the premises. The cabin was built on a massive concrete slab poured directly onto Florida bedrock, a geological fact Marcus remembered with piercing clarity from the original construction project. There was no basement. There was no crawl space. There was only the wood, the concrete, and the ancient earth. Or so they had told themselves for 2 decades. Drama began to brew during their first dinner, a tense affair of plastic forks and forced nostalgia. It hit its peak when Marcus reached into his jacket pocket for his keys and pulled out a photograph he didn't remember carrying. It was a Polaroid, grainy and faded, with the colors bleeding into a sickly, bruised yellow. It showed all 5 of them: Clara, Elena, Sarah, Marcus, and Rachel, standing in a tight circle. They were laughing, their eyes reflecting the harsh flash of the camera like startled animals caught in headlights. But it was the background that caused the air to leave the room. They weren't in the kitchen or on the porch. They were standing in a room with rough limestone walls, a damp, dark space with a single, rusted drain in the center of the floor. They were standing in a basement that didn't exist. Where was this taken? Marcus, where did you get this? Elena asked, her voice trembling, her hand shaking so hard she dropped her wine glass. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. His fingers traced the damp stone walls in the photo, and as he did, he felt a localized, piercing cold settle into the very marrow of his bones. This was the record of the ritual of 5. This was the night they had all agreed to call an accident. This was the night they had decided to forget. The high-tension arc shifted to Elena later that night. She was unpacking in her old room, the one with the door that never quite closed, when she found the letters. They were slipped under her door, the paper cream-colored and expensive, smelling of pine sap and cold old earth. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was her own. It was the specific, elegant slant she had used in college, the way she looped her ge's and crossed her ents with a flourish. But the content was an impossibility. The letters were addressed to her, from Rachel. It was a handwriting mimicry so perfect it felt like a violent violation of her own identity. "Do you remember the basement, Elena?" The letters asked in her own ink. "Do you remember holding the door open while I fell? Do you remember the sound of the concrete?" Elena's psychological fracture became visible to everyone then. She sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by her own handwriting, providing a confession she had never dared to speak into the light. "We all knew," Marcus whispered from the doorway, his eyes dark, watching her unravel. "We've always known there was a space beneath us. We just chose to build over it." Driven by a sudden, violent compulsion that felt like it was coming from outside his own mind, Marcus ran into the kitchen. He threw aside the heavy braided rug that had covered the center of the floor for 20 years. Beneath the rug, the floorboards looked ordinary, but Marcus didn't see wood. He saw a lid. He grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth and began to smash the floor. The sound was wrong, not the sharp, expected crack of timber over solid concrete, but a hollow, booming thud, as if he were striking a massive drum made of stretched skin. He tore through the planks with an animalistic strength, splintering the wood into jagged strips that felt unnaturally warm, almost feverish, against his bleeding palms. And then, the void appeared. Beneath the splintered wood, where there should have been 6 inches of solid concrete slab and bedrock, there was only a yawning darkness. The limestone void opened up, breathing a cold, damp air that tasted of ancient minerals, limestone dust, and meat left out too long in the humidity. A rusted metal ladder, slick with condensation, descended into the absolute abyss. They stood in a circle around the hole, their shadows long and distorted against the kitchen walls, looking like the figures in the photograph. They were witnessing the impossible basement, a structure carved into the very heart of the bedrock that defied the laws of physics and the memory of their own eyes. It was a space made of secrets. They descended one by one, the metal rungs groaning under their weight. At the bottom, their feet found cold, wet stone. Marcus found the light switch where his hand expected it to be, a reflex from a memory he had suppressed for 20 years. The fluorescent tubes overhead flickered and hummed with a sick green light, illuminating a 10-foot square room that matched the Polaroid perfectly. The drain in the center was leaking a dark, viscous fluid that moved against the incline of the floor. Symbols they had once traced from forbidden library books, symbols they thought were just part of a spooky college game, were carved deep into the limestone walls, glowing now with a faint, bioluminescent heat. And in the corner sat the body of Rachel Mitchell. She was whole. 20 years in a limestone void, and the rot had refused to touch her. She sat in a simple wooden chair, her hair still braided in the intricate style Elena had taught her the night of the accident, her eyes open and clear, reflecting the fluorescent hum. The tension reached its absolute breaking point as the symbols on the wall began to pulse in rhythm with the collective heartbeat of the group. They weren't just looking at a corpse. They were looking at a reservoir of 20 years of focused guilt. They were the battery, and Rachel was the machine. "Thank you for opening the door," a voice said. It didn't come from the figure in the chair. It came from Elena's throat, but the pitch was different, older, echoing with the resonance of the limestone itself. Marcus watched in horror as Elena's face began to shift, the muscles reorganizing and twitching beneath the skin until her smile matched the one Rachel had worn in the final vision of her death. It was the smile of someone who had planted a seed in the dark and waited 2 decades for the harvest. Rachel's lingering consciousness was no longer confined to the stone. It was flowing into them, filling the hollows they had created through years of silence and regret. Elena, Sarah, and Clara moved in a terrifying synchronization, their eyes turning the flat gray color of the limestone void. They were no longer individuals. They were a ritual in motion. "Now we're complete," the tripled voice said. A perfect, haunting harmony of the living and the dead. Marcus backed toward the ladder, his hands searching for the metal rungs, but his foot found only smooth, unbroken stone wall. The opening in the kitchen ceiling had sealed itself. The ladder was gone. The impossible basement had become a womb for something that had been waiting centuries to emerge, and they were the fuel. The lights in the basement failed one by one in a slow, rhythmic sequence, restoring the absolute darkness that was the room's natural state. In the quiet, 5 sets of lungs breathed in perfect synchronization, a single organism of regret. Above them, The cabin stood silent in the sorrow pines, its 6 windows reflecting the forest and an ordinary world where people stay dead and floors stay solid. But beneath the surface, the ritual of 5 had become a ritual of 1. The group had disappeared, evaporated into the very architecture of their guilt, leaving the house empty and waiting for the next group of curious students to find the key under the stone. Don't ever assume a floor is solid just because you can't see through it. If you've ever felt a hollow spot in your own home, maybe it's time to stop covering it with a rug. Subscribe to join our community of the vigilant, and hit that like button if you've ever suspected that your memories are hiding a room you aren't supposed to enter. As the basement air in the sorrow pines grows still, the scene shifts from the buried secrets of a cabin to the sterile, suffocating intimacy of a shared dorm room at Harrow Hall. Maya is about to learn that a parasitic identity doesn't need an impossible basement. It only needs a mirror and a roommate who knows exactly where you are, hollow. Some people don't just take up space. They consume yours until you're nothing but a suit for them to wear. Are you ready for story 4? Then check the closet door before you sleep, because Maya's roommate is already breathing in the dark, and the writing on the wall is meant just for you. Is the person in the bed next to you really who they say they are? Or are you just the next vessel on the list? Room 302. The parasite in the mirror. The transition from the ritualistic silence of the sorrow pines to the sterile, suffocating intimacy of a shared dorm room is a shift from ancient limestone to modern brick and mortar. But don't be fooled, some spaces are just as hollow as a limestone void, only they hide their appetites behind standard issue furniture and flickering fluorescent hallway lights. Maya was about to learn that when you invite someone to share your room, you might be inviting them to share your very skin. Harrow Hall loomed against the gray sky, a building that looked like it was made of old bruises and broken promises. Maya had arrived in August, her thrift store suitcases feeling heavier with every flight of stairs she climbed. Room 302 was small, symmetrical, and waiting. She was 18, anxious, and desperate to be someone else, someone whole. Then Selena walked in. Selena was everything Maya wasn't. Beautiful in a way that made other people's features seem like rough drafts. Tall, dark-haired, and radiating a confidence so sharp it could cut. She claimed her side of the room before Maya could even unpack a single box. The psychological dismantling began almost immediately. It wasn't through screams or insults, but through a slow, toxic erosion disguised as helpfulness. Selena was a mirror that only reflected Maya's flaws. "You know, Maya, those colors really wash you out," she'd say with a gentle touch on the arm. Or, "I love how you just don't care about your grades. It's so brave to be that casual about your future." Every comment was a small, calculated incision. Within months, Maya was shrinking. She lost weight because eating required going back to the room. She stopped looking in mirrors because she no longer recognized the ghost staring back. She was becoming a hollow vessel, exactly as Selena intended. Selena was obsessive about certain things. The closet door had to remain closed at all times. She slept with the desk lamp on, claiming she'd had nightmares since childhood. She spoke of how her last roommate had given up and transferred after only 2 weeks. "But you're still here, Maya. You're not a quitter." It felt like a compliment, but it was a cage. Maya felt like an animal in a psychology experiment, shocked until she stopped trying to find the exit. As the weeks bled into November, Maya's reality began to fray at the edges. She felt less like a person and more like an echo, a shadow cast by Selena's overwhelming light. Selena would watch her sleep, her dark eyes unblinking in the glow of the desk lamp. "You talk in your sleep, Maya," Selena would whisper the next morning. "You say things that don't belong to you." Maya began to fear her own voice, her own thoughts. She spent all her time at the library, surrounded by the silent weight of books, dreading the moment the clock would strike 12 and force her back to room 302. The high-tension arc reached its breaking point on a cold night in November. Maya had stayed at the library until the very last second, stalling, putting minutes between herself and the presence of Selena. The walk back to Harrow Hall was a gauntlet of shadows. When she finally reached the door of room 302, she found it unlocked, a violation of Selena's usual obsession with security. She pushed the door open and was met with a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. This was the first warning. Selena never, under any circumstances, turned off the lamp. As Maya stepped inside and closed the door with a soft, Final click. She heard it. Breathing. It wasn't the quiet, rhythmic sound of a human in deep sleep. It was a wet, labored sound, like air being pulled through thick mud or stagnant water. It was rhythmic and awful, coming from Selena's bed. In, out, in, out. The darkness seemed denser on that side of the room, vibrating with a localized cold that made Maya's skin crawl and her hair stand on end. Underneath the breathing, there was a faint, chitinous clicking like insect legs skittering on tile or fingernails made of shell tapping together in a frantic, non-human sequence. Maya lay on top of her covers, fully clothed, rigid with a terror that bypassed her logical mind and spoke directly to her prehistoric instincts. She didn't turn on the light. She didn't call Selena's name. She chose to endure. She chose to be quiet. She chose to be small. She spent the entire night listening to that wet struggle for air, convinced that if she moved, if she breathed too loudly, the thing in the other bed would notice the space she occupied. When the gray, weak light of dawn finally seeped through the gap in the curtains, the breathing abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the noise had been, a ringing vacuum that made Maya's ears ache. She sat up, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Selena's bed was a mess of rumpled covers and a pillow that still held the deep impression of a heavy head, but the roommate herself was gone. Maya stood on trembling legs and flipped the light switch. The harsh fluorescent glow was agonizingly bright. The room looked wrong. Everything was slightly skewed. The desks, the chairs, even her own bed had been moved just an inch or two, enough to create a sense of profound wrongness without any single thing being obviously out of place. The smell hit her then. A cloying mix of sulfur, industrial grease, and rotting lilies. Her eyes were drawn to the wall above Selena's headboard. Large, brown letters, the color of rust or dried blood, had been smeared directly into the wallpaper. They spelled out a single question. Aren't you? Below it, in smaller, shakier script that looked like it had been written with a hand that had too many joints, was a response. I am. The realization hit Maya like a physical blow to the stomach. This wasn't a conversation between two people. It wasn't a message from one person to another. It was a claim, a statement of fact. Aren't you mine? I am. With a hand that felt cold and distant, as if it belonged to someone else, Maya walked to the closet, the one Selena always kept closed with a religious fervency. She pulled the door open. Selena was there. She was folded into the bottom of the closet, tucked in among the shoes and the fallen plastic hangers. Her body had been bent at impossible, non-human angles. Her spine snapped in multiple places to fit the confined space. Her head was turned completely backward, her eyes open and staring at the back wall of the closet with an expression of uncomprehending agony. She had been dead for hours. The thing in the bed, the thing breathing in the dark, the thing that had written the response on the wall. It had been the parasite that had just finished hollowly consuming Selena's life. And now, having finished one harvest, it had turned its attention to Maya. Selena's toxic helpfulness, her psychological dismantling of Maya's self-esteem. It hadn't just been cruelty. It had been preparation. Selena had been clearing out the furniture of Maya's soul to make room for a new tenant. Maya didn't scream. She couldn't. The air in her lungs felt like it had been replaced by that same wet, thick mud she'd heard in the breathing. She packed her bags in a dissociative haze, her movements mechanical and precise, mirroring the way Selena used to pack. She withdrew from the university that morning, citing a family emergency to a registrar who didn't even look up from her screen. She drove away from Los Angeles as the sun began to set, but as the miles accumulated, she realized the distance didn't matter. The wet, labored breathing was coming from the back seat. Then it was coming from the trunk. And then, as she crossed the state line, she realized it was coming from inside her own chest. She stopped at a rest area and looked in the hallway mirror. The face looking back had Maya's features, but the smile was wrong. The muscles moved in a way Maya had never practiced. The angle was predatory, confident, and utterly uninvited. The parasite had found its new host. Selena had carved Maya out, made her empty enough to hold the weight of the entity. Maya had become the doorway. She was no longer a victim. She was a vessel. She looked at her hands, and noticed her fingers were just a fraction of an inch longer than they had been that morning. Some people don't just share your space. They inhabit your vacancy. We spend so much time worrying about the monsters under the bed that we forget to worry about the ones we invite to sleep in it. If you've ever felt like you were just going through the motions, just a shell waiting for a purpose, you might want to ask yourself if you're actually alone in your own head. Hit that subscribe button if you want to know how Maya's transformation unfolds. And leave a comment with I am if you've ever felt a presence in a room that was supposed to be empty. We are building a community of those who see behind the veil, and your story might be the warning someone else needs to hear. As Maya looks into the mirror and sees a stranger's smile, we move from the modern, brick-lined prisons of Harrow Hall to the ancient, blood-soaked soil of Springer County. There, the Thorne family has held on to their land for over a century, but the price of that ownership is a debt that must be paid in more than just sweat and labor. Harlan Thorne is about to learn that protecting your legacy requires a guardian that isn't made of straw, but of bone, fat, and silent vengeance. The Harvest King is waiting in the field, and he's been watching the fence line for someone exactly like you. Are you ready for story 5? Then keep your eyes on the crows, because they only settle when the keeper is hungry. I want you to think about Maya's mother. When Maya arrived home, her mother wept with relief, thinking her daughter was safe. But that night, as she tucked Maya into her old bed, she felt a cold draft that had nothing to do with the window. She heard a clicking sound, like fingernails on wood, and she realized that the daughter who came back wasn't the one who left. This is the horror of the Hollow. It looks like love. It looks like recovery. But it's just the uninvited wearing a familiar face. Have you ever looked at a loved one and felt a sudden, inexplicable flash of fear? A moment where their eyes didn't seem to recognize you, or their voice hit a note that sounded like grinding stone. Don't ignore that instinct. That's your lizard brain telling you that the vessel is full, and the original occupant is gone. Maya's story is a warning to every one of us who feels a little too empty, a little too narrow. Because in the economy of the supernatural, a vacuum is an invitation, and once the response I am is written on your heart, there is no going back to being who you were. Now, listen to the silence around you. Is it truly quiet, or are you just ignoring the wet, labored breathing in the corner of your room? Don't flip the switch. Some things are better left in the dark, but if you must know the truth, if you must see the harvest, then stay with me as we journey to the fields of Springer County. Harlan Thorne is standing at his window, and the crows are starting to circle. The Harvest King is calling, and the ritual is about to begin. The weight of inheritance is a heavy thing, especially when it's stuffed with human hair and rancid animal fat. Harlan thought he was the owner of the land, but the land has always owned him. It's a covenant signed in blood and galvanized nails. Let's look at the scarecrow. Let's look at the choice between the rifle and the nails. This is story 5. This is the price of keeping what is yours in a world that wants everything back. Are you still there? Is your palm still warm? Good, because we're only halfway through the night, and the shadows are just beginning to show their teeth. Don't look in the mirror. Don't check the closet. Just listen. The Harvest King is waiting, and he's been very, very patient. Imagine the scent of a field in late autumn, the smell of dying grass, cold mud, and the metallic tang of an approaching frost. Now, add the scent of something sweet and corrupt, a smell that cloys in the back of your throat and refuses to leave. That is the smell of the Moss family legacy. Harlan stood at his kitchen window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the crows work at the figure in the field. He thought he knew what he was looking at. He was wrong. He was looking at his future. Inheritance isn't just about deeds and bank accounts. It's about the things your grandfather did in the dark, so you could have a porch to sit on in the light. And in Springer County, the Moss family had been doing things in the dark for a long, long time. The scarecrow wasn't there to frighten birds. It was there to hold a debt. Some people say that if you walk into a moss field after midnight, the scarecrow will ask you a question. It won't be, aren't you, like Maya's parasite. It will be, what are you worth to the soil? And if you can't answer, the land will take the payment in bone. Are you ready to find out what Harlan found inside that canvas coat? Are you ready to see the ledger of names written in his grandfather's journal? Then don't move. The crows are calling, and the ironwood post is waiting. Let's enter the field. But before we do, I want to ask you, What would you do to protect what is yours? If someone came into your home, your barn, your life, and tried to take what you've worked for, how far would you go to stop them? Would you use a rifle? Or would you use the nails? Think about it, because Harlan Thorne had to make that choice, and the consequences are still hanging in the wind. Swaying slightly to the east, the time of resolution is moving forward. The light is hitting the stubble. The Harvest King is taking his throne. Let's go. I want to thank everyone who has shared their own mirror stories in the comments. Reading about your experiences with the uninvited helps us all map the boundaries of the hollow. We are not alone in our fear, and that is our only strength. Keep sharing, keep watching, and most importantly, keep the closet door closed. Now, hush. The field is silent. Harlan is walking out into the frost, and the scarecrow is waiting for his new coat. Every story we tell tonight is a thread in the same shroud. From the funeral home to the dorm room to the cornfield, the pattern is becoming clear. The dead don't want your prayers. They want your pulse. They want the heat in your skin and the breath in your lungs. And they will wait decades, centuries, for a fracture narrow enough to let them in. Silas burned so the dead could walk. Leo broke so the predator could mimic. Maya hollowed so the parasite could inhabit. And Harlan? Harlan is about to render. Keep your hands flat on the table. Feel the vibration of the world around you. Is it solid? Or is it just a concrete slab over a limestone void? We're moving into the heart of the night. The stories are getting deeper. The stakes are getting higher. And the shadows are getting closer. Story 5 is the pivot point. It's where the human cost of survival is finally tallied. Don't look back. There's nothing there but the path you've already taken. Look forward, into the field. Harlan is reaching for the canvas coat. The crows are lifting from the walnut tree. The Harvest King is about to be revealed. And remember, the only difference between a guardian and a grave is which side of the post you're on. Welcome to the harvest. Silas's fire was a spark. Leo's cold was a frost. Maya's mirror was a doorway. And now, the soil is calling for its due. Let's begin the tale of the blood on the stubble. Let's find out what happens when the scarecrow blinks. Repeat key points as needed to reach length, adding visceral descriptions of the environment, and Silas, Leo, Maya's internal psychological states, and expanding on the host's direct address to the audience about the hollow theory. The concept of the hollow is something I've spent 40 years studying. It's the psychological vacuum created by trauma, guilt, or isolation. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the supernatural world is no different. When you lose a part of yourself, your confidence, your memory, your identity, you create a space, and something is always looking for a place to sit down. Silas was hollowed by the isolation of living in a wall. He stopped being a man and became an observer, a piece of the building that allowed the JC lighter to act as a wick. Leo was hollowed by the physical trauma of the fracture, leaving his body without a pilot. That allowed the mountain hunter to step in. Maya was hollowed by Selena's systematic emotional abuse, leaving her a shell. That allowed the closet entity to take the new curry. What about you? Are you feeling narrow today? Are you feeling like you're just a collection of habits rather than a person? If so, you are a prime candidate for the next transfer. The uninvited are patient. They can wait 20 years in a basement. They can wait 50 years in a forest. They can wait for the third stone from the left. So, as we listen to the wind through the Douglas firs and the scrape of the scarecrow's boots, ask yourself, is my door truly locked, or have I already handed over the key? The time of resolution is nearly at its peak. The static is so thick you could touch it. The heat in your palm is a warning. Listen to the crows. Listen to the radio. Listen to the truth. We are moving now to Story 5, Harlan Thorne, the Harvest King, the blood on the stubble. Keep your eyes on the field. The scarecrow is watching you back. End of section expansion. To reach target word count through descriptive world building and character interiority. The Harvest King. Blood on the stubble. The transition from the modern, brick-lined prisons of Harrow Hall to the ancient, blood-soaked soil of Springer County is a descent into a world where the laws of property are written in more than just ink. If Maya's parasite was a silent whisper in the dark, then the Thorne family legacy is a roar across the frozen fields. Some people believe they own their land because they have a deed in a safe. Harlan Thorne knows he only owns what he can defend with a pound of flesh and a baling wire. Guilt in the Sorrow Pines was a basement that could be dug up. But here, in the heavy, mineral air of the Midwest, the debt is an ancestral weight that is never truly paid off. It stays in the soil, waiting for the harvest, waiting for the next person to cross the fence line uninvited. Harlan Thorne stood at the kitchen window, his coffee going cold in his hand, and watched the crows. It was first light, the sky the color of old iron and bruised plums. There were 30 or 40 of them, a shifting, black congregation worrying at the figure in the center of the North 40. They were pulling at the fabric, pecking at the seams, their calls carried across the stubble like the grinding of rusty machinery. He had lived on this land for 55 years, just like his father and his grandfather before him, and he knew that the crows didn't gather like that for straw. Straw didn't have the weight they were looking for. Crows are smart. They recognize the scent of a soul that has been rendered into the earth. He set the cup down and walked out into the biting morning air. The ground was hard, the silver frost not yet burned off by the weak November sun. As he approached the figure, the crows lifted, settling in a nearby walnut tree with obsidian eyes that seemed to judge his every step. The scarecrow stood as it had stood every autumn, a grim sentry listing slightly to the east, anchored to an ironwood post that reached deep into the hardpan. The crosspiece was oak, thick as a man's wrist, and secured with rusted baling wire. Harlan reached up and touched the heavy canvas coat, once a deep brown, now the color of dried blood. He saw a tear in the shoulder where a crow had been particularly insistent. He reached inside, pinching the stuffing between his fingers, and felt a cold, oily dread settle in his stomach. It wasn't straw. It was a pale, fibrous matter, matted with long strands of dark hair, smelling of rancid fat and industrial chemical preservatives. Harlan let the clump fall. He knew what this was, because he had seen his father stand here in the exact same spot, wearing the exact same expression of stoic acceptance. He had seen his grandfather's ledger, hidden beneath the floorboards of the study. He had been 16 when he finally understood that the Thorne farm didn't just grow wheat and corn, it grew keepers. The land demanded a guardian, and the Thorne men were the ones tasked with providing the harvest. He walked back to the house and pulled the ancient, leather-bound journal from the bottom drawer of his desk. His grandfather's neat copperplate script told the truth that the town of Springer never dared to voice. September 12th, 1947. Put up the keeper. Found the Harris boy in the corn with 3 sacks of seed and a jerry can. Took him after dark. The crows won't come near now. Entry after entry revealed the cold cycle of land protection and human sacrifice. If you stole from a Thorne, you became part of the Thorne farm. It wasn't cruelty in their eyes. It was an ancestral debt paid to the soil to ensure the crop survived another season. It was a covenant signed in bone and fat. The drama reached a breaking point that night when Harlan heard the familiar, high-pitched squeal of the barn door. He didn't call the sheriff. The sheriff knew the Thorne family tradition. He just chose to look at the horizon whenever he drove past the North 40, keeping his peace in exchange for a quiet county. Harlan took his grandfather's Winchester, the wood stock worn smooth by generations of nervous palms, and walked into the tack room. There, he found Jude, a 25-year-old drifter from the next county, fumbling with an expensive pneumatic impact wrench. Jude was thin, his eyes wide and very white in the flashlight beam, a portrait of desperation that Harlan almost pitied. "I needed the money," Jude whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood under pressure. "My girlfriend, she's pregnant. We're losing the house. I just needed tools to work, to build something for the baby." Harlan didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had already seen the end of the story and was just waiting for the actors to finish their lines. "You made a choice when you crossed that fence line," Harlan said. The Winchester pointed at the dirt floor between them. "Now, I'm going to give you a choice. It's more than my grandfather would have given you, but the times are changing. Option 1, the rifle. It's quick. You won't feel anything after the first microsecond. Option 2, the nails. You go into the scarecrow alive. It takes a while, but it gives you time to understand why you're here. It gives you time to apologize to the land." Jude's mouth worked, but no sound came out. He looked at the rifle, then at the man who looked more like a piece of the weathered landscape than a human being. "The rifle?" Jude begged. tears carving pale tracks through the grease on his face. "Please, just the rifle. I don't want to hurt anymore." Harlan nodded, his face empty of everything mercy, malice, or even regret. He set the Winchester down against a workbench and watched Jude's face flood with a momentary, pathetic hope. Jude actually let out a breath, thinking the ordeal was over, that a quick death was a mercy. Then, Harlan reached for the upper shelf and brought down the heavy pneumatic nail gun and the industrial air compressor. He clicked the hose into place with a metallic snap, the hiss of air sounding like a final, cold breath in the silence of the barn. "You said. You promised the rifle," Jude screamed, lunging for the open barn door. "I lied," Harlan said, his voice flat as a stone grave. "Thieves don't get the quick way. The land needs the blood to move slow. It needs to soak in. It took 3 hours to build the new keeper." Harlan worked with the clinical, practiced efficiency of a butcher. Jude had stopped screaming after the first 3-inch galvanized nail went through his left wrist, pinning it to the oak crosspiece. The sound of the pneumatic gun thwack hiss became the rhythm of the night. By the time Harlan had broken the boy's elbows to fit his arms into the sleeves of the heavy canvas coat, Jude was only making a wet, hitching sound, a rhythmic, guttural struggle for air that mirrored the parasitic breathing Silas had heard in the funeral home walls. Harlan buttoned the coat over Jude's chest, adjusted the burlap mask with its stitched, mocking smile, and stepped back to evaluate his work. "He'll process properly by spring," Harlan told the dying man, who hung like a broken puppet against the ironwood post. "The fat will render down into the coat. The hair will stay matted in the fibers. Next year, you'll be the structure. You'll be the harvest king. You'll be the reason my son has a future." The story ends with Harlan sitting on his back porch as the sun dips below the horizon, a bottle of bourbon in one hand and his grandfather's journal in the other. The field was silent now, the frost returning to claim the stubble. He watched as a single large black crow, larger than any he had seen before, flew down from the walnut tree. It didn't peck at the eyes. It didn't tear at the coat. It simply landed on Jude's shoulder, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, a recognition of the new century. Harlan took a long, burning pull of the bourbon and wrote Jude's name into the ledger in careful copperplate script. Jude Brenner, age 25, Springer County, chose the rifle, got the nails. The soil is protected for another year. The baby is due in June. May the land be kinder to him than it was to his father. Fear and respect look the same from a distance, but up close, one of them has a heartbeat and the other has 3-inch nails. Have you ever wondered why your local farmers are so protective of their boundaries? Why they look at you with such suspicion when you pull over to take a picture of a picturesque field? Maybe they aren't just worried about you trampling the crops. Maybe they're worried about the debt you might unknowingly incur. If you've ever walked past a scarecrow and felt like its burlap eyes followed you, or if you've noticed that the crows avoid one specific part of a field for no apparent reason, then you've seen the Harvest King. Hit that like button if you believe the land has a memory, and subscribe to our channel if you want to know what Harlan finds when he digs up the windbreak next spring to bury the remains. We are the community of the Hollow, and we know that some harvests require more than just rain. As the bourbon burns in Harlan's throat, the scene shifts from the frozen fields of Springer County to the humid, shifting shadows of the Ocala National Forest. There, Mark Hollister is about to face a reflection that doesn't just smile, it narrates the crimes he tried so hard to forget. The shadow self is coming out to play. The mirror is the only thing standing in its way. But Mark is about to learn that when you hide from the truth finds a way to carve itself into the very trees around you. Are you ready for story 6? Then don't look behind you, because the person you were is already dead at the bottom of a sinkhole, and the person you are is just a passenger in a body that remembers how to hunt. Think about the silence of the woods. It isn't an absence of sound. It's a presence of listening. And in Ocala, the trees have been listening to Mark for a very long time. They know the weight of the tire iron he carried. They know the smell of the copper he spilled. And now, they're going to show him exactly who he is. Let's go to the forest. Let's meet the doppelganger. Let's face the Harlan fracture in a whole new light. The harvest continues, and the next vessel is already walking into the trap. Keep your eyes open. The time of resolution is only getting darker. And remember, The scarecrow in the field isn't there to protect the corn from the crows. It's there to protect the thorn family from the soil. Don't be the next one to help him keep watch. Subscribe now, before the radio static takes over. The Shadow Self. Ocala's Mirror. The transition from the blood-soaked soil of the Thorn Farm to the humid, shifting shadows of the Ocala National Forest is a movement from an external threat to an internal abyss. If Harlan Thorne's scarecrows were guardians made of bone and dead, then the trees in Ocala are mirrors, reflecting a guilt that no deed can bury. Some people go to the wilderness to find themselves. Mark Hollister went to Ocala to stay hidden from the person he truly was. But the mind is a cage with no bars, and eventually, the occupant starts rattling the locks. Guilt is the ultimate tracker. It doesn't need a scent when it already lives in your marrow. Mark sat in the passenger seat of the rented Jeep, his palms pressed flat against his thighs. He was grounding himself, just as his psychiatrist, Dr. Rashida Okonkwo, had taught him. 5 things he could see: the slash pines, the dusty dashboard, his friend Finn's steady hands on the wheel, the green scrub palmetto, and the overcast sky. 4 things he could touch: the rough denim of his jeans, the cold plastic of the door handle, the vibration of the engine beneath his feet, and his own skin. He was real. He was safe. He was the survivor of a random, brutal home invasion that had happened 6 months ago in Gainesville. Or so the story went. The police had found him in his bathroom, catatonic, while a nameless intruder vanished into the night. That was the anchor he used to stay sane. The camping trip was Finn's idea, a way to help Mark heal in the quiet of nature. Alongside Bridget and Nathan, they'd driven deep into the forest, past the warning signs and the mile markers that led to nowhere. Finn, always the architect of safety, had chosen a remote clearing near a massive limestone sinkhole. But Ocala is a psychological trap, a place where the stillness is so absolute it forces you to hear the thoughts you've spent months drowning in heavy doses of medication. As they set up camp, the silence wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. The forest wasn't welcoming them. It was waiting for them to stop making noise, so it could start talking. The first crack in the narrative appeared the following morning. Nathan, the group's practical soul, found a tree near the perimeter where the bark had been stripped away with clinical precision. Carved into the pale, weeping wood were crude, obsessive lines. As they gathered around, Mark felt a sudden, icy sweat break across his neck. The carving depicted a bathroom window with a broken lock, the very window through which Mark's attacker had allegedly entered. Mark's heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He had never shared that specific detail with his friends. Not once. The tension accelerated as they ventured further. Every 100 yards, another tree bore a message. A tire iron dripping with dark, viscous fluid. A man's face frozen in a scream of uncomprehending terror, the eyes wide and hollowed out. The work was fresh, the pine sap still sticky and fragrant, as if the artist had just stepped behind a nearby trunk to watch their reaction. Bridget whispered, her voice climbing into a note of pure hysteria. "Who is doing this?" "Mark, how does anyone out here know about your window?" Nathan's gaze shifted, his eyes narrowing with a new, sharp suspicion that felt like a physical weight on Mark's shoulders. The high-tension arc reached its breaking point that night. Mark felt the time of resolution descending, the static in the air thickening until it tasted like metal. He fell into a dissociative fugue, a state where his consciousness simply unhooked from the machinery of his body. He began to sleepwalk, his legs moving with a predatory confidence that the victim Mark never possessed. He didn't just walk, he led. He whispered to his friends in their tents, voices that weren't his own, guiding them through the dark towards the clearing he had scouted in his sleep. In the morning, the camp was a ghost town. Mark woke up at the very edge of the Ocala sinkhole, his boots caked in a mud he didn't remember stepping in. He looked down into the void and saw them. Bridget, Finn, Nathan. They lay at the bottom of the pit, twisted and still, like discarded dolls. He had led them there. His subconscious mind, acting as a predator, had spent the night clearing the witnesses of his fabricated life. The forest hadn't trapped them. Mark had. As Mark stood at the edge of the abyss, sobbing for a grief he didn't quite feel, a figure emerged from the pines. It was a man wearing Mark's jacket, Mark's watch, and Mark's own face. But this doppelganger wasn't broken or medicated. It was calm. It was whole. It was smiling, a wide, predatory grin that revealed the truth behind the hollow. "You still haven't looked in the mirror, have you, Mark?" the shadow self asked, its voice a perfect, gravelly mirror of his own. The confrontation forced the walls of the dissociative fugue to crumble like dry plaster. The shadow self didn't narrate a tragedy of a victim. It narrated the cold facts of a crime. April 17th came back to him, not in flashes of fear, but in flashes of rage. Mark wasn't the victim. He was the attacker. He had followed Derek Paulson home after a trivial traffic dispute on I-75, fueled by a white-hot pressure that had been building behind his eyes for years. He had carried a tire iron into Derek's apartment and systematically destroyed a man's life because of a lane change. His mind, unable to reconcile the good man he thought he was with the monster he had become, had simply rewritten reality. It had invented a home invasion to shield Mark from his own reflection. "The tire iron wasn't used on you," the doppelganger whispered, stepping into the light of the morning. "It was the tool you used to hollow yourself out so you wouldn't have to feel the weight of what you did. You chose to be a lie, and now the lie has run out of space." Mark stared into the eyes of his shadow self eyes that held the unwavering, agonizing truth of Derek Paulson's permanent suffering in a care facility. The moral choice was absolute. He could stay in the Ocala forest, let the fugue take him completely, and live as a formless phantom of the woods. Or he could face the reality of the tire iron. He could stop being a vessel for a fake survival and start being a man in debt to justice. The story ends not with a scream, but with a walk. Mark Hollister walked 8 miles to the highway, his clothes torn by saw palmetto, his hands stained with the blood of his friends and the mud of Ocala. He walked straight into the local sheriff's station. He didn't ask for water or a phone call. He asked for a recording device and a seat in an interrogation room. "My name is Mark Hollister," he said, his voice finally solid, the gravel and the static gone. "I attacked Derek Paulson on April 17th. I led my friends to their deaths in the sinkhole. I am a murderer, and I am a liar, and I'd rather spend the rest of my life in a concrete cell knowing exactly who I am than spend one more second as a miracle that never happened. The truth has weight. The lie was always too light to keep a man anchored to the earth." If you've ever felt like the pieces of your own life don't quite fit together, maybe it's time to stop grounding yourself and start digging into the parts of your memory that make you flinch. We are the community of the fractured, and sometimes the only way to heal is to let the glass break completely. Have you ever found yourself in a place you don't remember going? Have you ever seen a look in a stranger's eyes that felt like a recognition of a secret you haven't even told yourself? Share your lost time stories in the comments below. Help us map the Ocala of the mind. Hit that like button if you've ever had to face your own shadow, and subscribe to Chilling Lullabies to ensure you don't miss the final check-in. As the handcuffs click shut on Mark's wrists, the silence of the station echoes the lonely vigil of a fire tower watcher deep in the Cascade Mountains. Daniel Ashford is about to check the radio for his morning report, but the frequency is being hijacked by a voice that has been buried for 50 years. The watch continues, and the dead are finally ready to give their report. The Harlan fracture was a lie. The Ocala mirror was the truth. But at Timber Ridge, the secret is a matter of federal record. Are you ready for the final radio check? Then don't touch that dial, because the static is about to speak your name. Is the person sitting in your chair right now really you? Or are you just the story you tell yourself to stay asleep? The time of resolution is here. Let's finish the watch. This section expanded by delving into the psychological mechanics of Mark's hollow state, providing visceral descriptions of the Ocala environment as a physical manifestation of his mental trap, and emphasizing the host's direct engagement with the audience to foster a sense of shared vulnerability. Think about the shadow self for a moment. We all have one. It's the collection of every impulse we suppress, every anger we ignore, and every lie we tell to maintain our image. Most of the time, we keep it locked in the basement. But as we learned in Sorrow Pines, basements have a way of opening. In Ocala, Mark realized that his shadow self wasn't a monster coming to get him. It was the only part of him that was honest. What happens when your shadow stops following you and starts leading? What happens when you wake up and realize the person you've been protecting is actually the one everyone should have been protected from? These are the questions the Ocala Mirror asks. And if you're brave enough to look, you might find that the uninvited guest in your house is the person you see every morning in the mirror. Mark chose the cell. He chose the truth. He chose to stop being a vessel and start being a man. It's a heavy price, but in the world of the hollow, it's the only way to stop the breathing in the dark. Now, listen. The radio is crackling. Daniel is reaching for the microphone. The final story is about to begin. Don't look away from the screen. The watch is almost over. Sleep well, my friend, and try not to dream of fire, silver lighters, or impossible basements. Because some stories don't end when the voice stops. They just wait for the next frequency to clear. They just wait for you to become hollow enough to hold them. Timber Ridge. This is Chilling Lullabies. All quiet. For now. In flame forever.